This is a story that has fascinated people for decades. It's one of those cases that, no matter how you look at it, it just doesn't seem to make sense. In 1979, the New York Times called it one of the Western world's most convincing cases of reincarnation. Now, a lot of stories about past lives are hard to verify. There's usually no real proof you can point to today. But this one is different. This is the story of a woman named Dorothy Eady, who later became known as Om Seti. And her life story and the things she claimed to remember from a past life led to real, verifiable, modern-day discoveries in Egypt. Things that professional Egyptologists and historians just couldn't explain. For decades, they tried to prove she was a fraud, that she was lying. And they never could. She knew things she just shouldn't have known. Things that make you stop and wonder, what if she was telling the truth? Our story begins in London in 1904. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family. She was an only child, and her parents absolutely adored her. Life was normal, quiet, and happy for the first 3 years. And then, one day, everything changed. Little 3-year-old Dorothy was playing in her home when she took a terrible fall down a flight of stairs. She was knocked completely unconscious. Her parents were frantic. They called for the family doctor, who rushed over to the house. He examined Dorothy, and after a few moments, he had to deliver the worst news imaginable. He turned to her parents and told them their daughter was dead. The next hour was just a blur of grief for her parents. The doctor was there, trying to console them, talking about what needed to happen next. They were in a state of total shock. But then, about an hour after the doctor had pronounced her dead, they heard something, a sound coming from Dorothy's bedroom. They went to check, and they could not believe their eyes. There was Dorothy, sitting up on her bed, playing as if nothing had happened. They rushed in, the doctor right behind them, and they were all just speechless. Dorothy seemed perfectly fine. Her parents, in their confusion and relief, turned on the doctor. They were furious, yelling at him for pronouncing her dead when she was clearly alive. But the doctor was adamant. He swore she had been gone. He had checked for a pulse, for breath. There was nothing. He had no medical explanation for what had just happened. In the days and weeks after the accident, Dorothy's parents noticed some changes. The biggest one was her voice. She started speaking with a strange accent, one they couldn't place at all. They took her to doctors and specialists who suggested she might be suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome. It's a real medical condition that can happen after a significant head injury, and it basically alters a person's speech patterns. To someone who doesn't know, it can sound like they suddenly have a foreign accent. But that wasn't the only strange thing. Dorothy also started talking about a recurring dream. She told her parents that every night she would dream of a huge building with massive pillars. And right next to this building was the most beautiful garden she had ever seen. She would describe the flowers, the trees, the feeling of peace she had when she was there. It was like an oasis. She loved this garden more than anything. But in the dream, she didn't know where it was. And being just 3 or 4 years old, she had a hard time articulating exactly what she was seeing. All she knew was that she loved this place in her dreams, and she talked about it constantly. It got to the point where her mother would often find her crying in her bed, either before going to sleep or right after waking up. When her mother asked what was wrong, Dorothy would say she wanted to go home. Her mother would try to reassure her, saying, "But honey, you are home." And Dorothy would shake her head and insist, "No, I'm not. My home is there, in the garden." She was completely convinced that the place in her dreams was her real home, and nothing her parents said could change her mind. A little while later, when Dorothy was still very young, her parents decided to take her on a trip to the British Museum. The museum had a large exhibit on ancient Egypt. As they walked in, Dorothy spotted the Egyptian section from across the room. Her eyes went wide. She saw the towering statues of pharaohs, the pictures of the pyramids and the Sphinx, and then she just took off. She sprinted away from her parents, running straight into the exhibit. She ran up to the statues, these ancient stone figures, and started kissing their feet. She was sobbing, completely overcome with emotion, and yelling out loud, "I'm home! I'm home! I'm with my people!" This tiny little girl was having this huge emotional revelation right there in the middle of the museum. Her parents were mortified. People were staring, wondering what on earth was wrong with their child. They eventually managed to calm her down and get her to leave, but something had clicked into place for Dorothy. From that day forward, she knew. The beautiful garden from her dreams, the place she longed for, was in Egypt. Her newfound obsession with ancient Egypt started to cause problems. Her family was very devoutly Catholic, and they sent her to Sunday school. But Dorothy would constantly compare the teachings of Catholicism with what she knew about ancient Egyptian religions. This did not go over well. Eventually, the church told her she couldn't come to Sunday school anymore. Then, she was expelled from her Catholic school. The reason was that she refused to sing certain hymns, specifically ones that she felt were disrespectful to the ancient Egyptians. She was even barred from attending Sunday Mass. By the age of 6, Dorothy, who was already a good reader and writer in English, became fascinated with Egyptian hieroglyphics. The moment she saw them, she said they felt familiar, but it was like a language she had forgotten how to read. When she was 7 years old, she was looking through a book one day when she saw a picture. It was a photograph of the Temple of Seti I, which is in a place called Abydos, Egypt. The picture showed the Grand Temple, and next to it were the crumbling remains of what looked like it might have once been a garden. As soon as Dorothy saw it, she pointed and said, "That's it. That's my home." She was absolutely certain. That temple in Abydos was where she was from. She looked closer at the picture, at the broken, tattered remains next to the temple walls. "That's the garden," she said. "But where are all the trees? Why does it look like this?" She couldn't understand that thousands of years had passed. In her mind, she was seeing her home, but it was ruined. The textbook also had a picture of the pharaoh the temple was named after, Seti I. When she saw the image of his very well-preserved mummy, she was once again overcome with emotion. She said she had known him. She remembered him personally. This incredible knowledge didn't go unnoticed. At age 10, she caught the attention of a world-renowned Egyptologist named A. Wallace Budge. He was so impressed by her passion and her strange familiarity with the subject that he offered to personally teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics. She picked it up almost instantly, as if she were just remembering something she already knew. As she got older, the dreams continued. But starting around age 14, a new one began. It was a nightmare. In this nightmare, she was trapped in a dark underground room. A high priest was there, interrogating her, demanding she answer his questions. When she refused, he had her beaten. This dream would haunt her for years. Fast forward to when Dorothy, now called Edie, was 27. She met an Egyptian man, and they fell in love. But it's also very likely she saw the marriage as a way to finally get to Egypt. She wanted to secure Egyptian residency. As soon as they were married, they moved. The moment their boat landed in Egypt, Edie was overwhelmed. She got down on her hands and knees, kissed the ground, and cried, saying over and over again, "I'm home. I'm finally home." She and her husband soon had a son, and in a move that surprised no one who knew her, they named him Seti. Once she was living in Egypt, Edie's experiences became even more intense. She claimed she started receiving nightly visits from a spiritual entity she called Hora. She believed Hora was the spirit of the pharaoh, Seti I. For about a year, these visits would happen almost every night. Her husband would wake up in the middle of the night to find her in a trance-like state. She would be sitting up, her eyes glazed over, frantically writing in a notebook. But she wasn't writing in English. She was writing page after page of perfect, intricate hieroglyphics. Her husband said he couldn't snap her out of it. It was like she was possessed, just writing and writing. Edie later explained that Hora was dictating her life story to her, the story of who she used to be. Over the course of that year, she filled over 70 pages with this story, all written in hieroglyphics. And the story went like this. Before she was Dorothy Edie, she was an Egyptian woman named Bentrashite, which means harp of joy. She had lived 3,000 years earlier during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a simple vegetable seller. Her mother died when Bentrashite was only 3 years old. Her father, unable to care for her on his own, placed her in the temple at Qom el Sultan, which was near Abydos. She was raised in the temple and eventually became a priestess. When she turned 12, she was given a choice. She could either leave the temple and go out into the world on her own, or she could stay and become a consecrated virgin, dedicating her life to the gods. Bentrashit chose to stay and took the vows. But a few years later, she met Pharaoh Seti I. They fell in love and began a secret relationship. Soon after, she discovered she was pregnant. For a consecrated virgin priestess, this was a catastrophic transgression. The high priest of the temple found out and interrogated her fiercely, demanding to know the name of the father. This interrogation, she realized, was the scene from her recurring nightmare. He had her beaten when she refused to name Seti. Bentrashit knew that if the truth came out, it would cause a massive public scandal for the pharaoh, the man she loved. Unwilling to let that happen, she took her own life. This entire experience, the nightly trances, the obsessive writing of hieroglyphics, the bizarre story of a past life, was all too much for Edie's husband. He grew more and more disturbed by her behavior. In 1936, he filed for divorce. After the divorce, Dorothy and her young son, Seti, moved to a town near the Giza pyramids. It was around this time that she stopped going by Dorothy Edie. She adopted a new name, Seti, which in Arabic means Mother of Seti. She was fully embracing her new identity, one that was deeply connected to ancient Egypt. She soon took a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, beginning a long and surprisingly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti dedicated her life to her work. She researched and wrote and drew, becoming an expert. Her primary focus, of course, was the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. She learned everything there was to know about its history, its architecture, and the people who lived and worked there 3,000 years ago. It was, after all, the place she believed had been her home. But incredibly, for all those years, she never actually went there. It wasn't until 1952, when she was almost 50 years old, that she finally got the chance to set foot in Abydos. A job transfer came up, and she jumped at the opportunity. In fact, she was so desperate to go that she even took a significant pay cut to get the position. The moment she walked into the temple grounds, she felt a profound sense of familiarity. The first thing she said was, "It's as if I've lived here before." She quickly set up an office for herself in one of the temple's rooms and spent nearly all of her time there, working and just being in the space. She even developed a strange friendship with a wild cobra that lived on the grounds. She would feed it every day, and the snake would just hang out with her. Nobody could make sense of it. Rumors flew around about this eccentric Englishwoman, but her contributions to Egyptology were so significant and so valuable that she earned the deep respect of her colleagues, even if they thought her personal beliefs were strange. But of all her accomplishments, Seti is most famous for what happened shortly after she arrived at the temple. She had been dreaming of that beautiful garden her entire life. She walked around the crumbling exterior of the temple, and then she pointed to a specific spot. She told the chief inspector of antiquities that if they dug right there, they would find the temple garden. The archaeologists were skeptical. There were no records, no texts, nothing to suggest a garden had ever been in that location. But Seti was so certain. She didn't just point to the spot, she described the entire layout. She told them where the pathways would be, what kinds of trees they would find, and where those trees were planted. To appease her, and probably to prove her wrong, they decided to dig. And they were stunned. They dug down, and there it was. A garden. Exactly where she said it would be. And as they excavated, they found that the layout, the root systems of the ancient trees, everything matched her descriptions perfectly. This was information she could not have possibly known. It wasn't written down anywhere. But that was just the beginning. She then told them to excavate on the north side of the temple. She said there was a secret, undiscovered tunnel that ran underneath the temple from that side. Again, the archaeologists were doubtful. But again, they dug. And sure enough, there was the tunnel. It was a major discovery, and only she knew about it. Her uncanny knowledge didn't stop at the temple. She also pointed researchers to a specific unexplored area in the Valley of the Kings, a famous burial ground for pharaohs. She told them they would find a long-forgotten tomb there. They searched where she indicated, and they found a tomb that had never been discovered before. Time and time again, she provided information that led to incredible finds. The other Egyptologists, the scientists and academics, they didn't want to believe her story about reincarnation. They wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a strange woman, maybe an elaborate and clever hoax. But they were faced with a problem they couldn't solve. They couldn't deny the results. She possessed an intimate, detailed knowledge of the Temple of Seti I and the surrounding area during the exact time frame she claimed to have lived there as Bentreshit. They simply could not explain how she knew what she knew. Right before she passed away at the age of 81, Seti shared one final secret. She said that deep beneath the Temple of Seti I, there is a secret chamber. And inside that chamber, there is another secret, a library of records or a hidden tomb, something of incredible importance. But she passed away before she could give more specific directions. No one knows exactly where to begin looking. And so, without Seti to guide them, her final secret may be one that is lost to time. Her story leaves us with so many questions. Without any logical, rational explanation for her knowledge, for her ability to pinpoint lost gardens and secret tunnels, even skeptics are left to wonder. Was she a brilliant hoaxer who somehow found lost information that no one else could? Or was Dorothy Eady, the little girl from London, truly the reincarnation of a priestess from ancient Egypt? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the very early hours of the 27th of March 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in his bed in a small farmhouse in rural Ohio. He heard his bedroom door creak open. He figured it was probably just his great-grandparents, Jack and Linda, coming in to check on him like they sometimes did. So, being a little kid, he just squeezed his eyes shut and pretended to be sound asleep. He heard the floorboards groan as whoever it was walked slowly across the room. He could hear them getting closer and closer. And then the sounds stopped. They were standing right next to his bed, looking down at him. He could almost feel them there. His curiosity got the better of him. He opened his eyes, just a tiny crack, just enough to peek. But what he saw standing there in the dark was not his great-grandmother or his great-grandfather. It was a huge green monster. On the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of March 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers was driving her car down a quiet, 2-lane road in Darkey County, Ohio. Darkey County was the kind of place that was mostly made up of very small towns, separated by huge stretches of farmland. It was peaceful. As Linda drove, the sun was setting over a wide-open field, casting long shadows across the road. She was on her way home from the pizza shop that she and her husband Jack owned together in a nearby town. It was a normal end to a normal day. Eventually, Linda turned off the paved road and onto a long gravel driveway. This led to the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and Jack lived. She parked her car in front of their old farmhouse, a place that felt like home in every way. She reached into the back seat and grabbed the deposit bag. It was full of the cash earnings from the pizza shop for that day. She got out of the car, and the quiet of the countryside settled around her. The farm was so isolated that you couldn't hear any traffic from the main road. The only sounds were the sheep bleating softly in the pasture and the hum of power tools coming from the big barn out back. She walked around to the back of the barn, and there was Jack. He was hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car, tinkering away. Jack and Linda had been married for about 7 years. This was Linda's third marriage, but with Jack, she truly felt like she had found her soulmate. He was a hard worker. On top of co-owning the pizza shop with Linda, he also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant. And, as if that wasn't enough, he ran a side business restoring classic cars. Linda often found him out here working on a car as the sun went down. It was just who he was. Sitting in the grass next to the car, playing with a small wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. The moment Damien saw Linda, his face lit up with a huge smile. He dropped the wrench, jumped to his feet, and ran over to give her a big, tight hug. Seeing Damien's happy face always made Linda feel a little bittersweet. Damien was the son of her granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had gotten pregnant when she was only 14 years old. She was just a child herself and wasn't in any position to raise a baby. So, Linda and Jack had stepped in. They offered to take Damien and raise him for a few years, just until Amber could finish high school and get her life on a stable track. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, and it came with its own set of problems. One of the biggest problems was Damien's father. He was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement and having limited access to his son. Even now, 4 years later, he still argued with Linda about it. He would insist that he wanted to be a part of Damien's life, but Linda was worried. She had a deep fear that he would eventually just abandon the boy, and she couldn't bear the thought of her great-grandson going through that kind of pain. So, she kept him at a distance. Besides, Linda thought Damien was going to have another father figure in his life very soon. In the past few years, Amber had really turned her life around. She had finished school, she had met a wonderful new man, and they had gotten married. Their plan was to take Damien in and raise him themselves as soon as he finished his current year of preschool, which was only a couple of months away. Linda was incredibly proud of Amber and how much she had matured. But she also felt a pang of sadness. She and Jack were going to miss having Damien around the farm. They loved him more than anything. In many ways, he was like their own son. Linda could see that Jack was completely focused on the car engine and probably didn't want to be interrupted. So she just said a quick hello to him, then scooped Damien up into her arms and carried him toward the farmhouse. She opened the back door, set Damien down inside, and told him to go wash his hands for dinner. Then she walked into the kitchen and tossed the deposit bag from the pizza shop onto a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to take it to the bank first thing in the morning. Linda got a pan out and started cooking dinner. A few minutes later, her husband Jack came inside, his hands and arms covered in car grease. While Jack washed up at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him how his day had been. Jack just grumbled a bit. He was annoyed about a customer he'd sold a car to on a payment plan the year before. The customer had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out to the guy's house the next day and repossess the car. Linda could tell Jack was tense, but she knew it wasn't just about the missed car payment. The truth was, Jack had been on edge for the past week or so. It all started after he had a huge argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been a shy, mild-mannered kid who was really close with his dad. He had even been the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life seemed to be falling apart. He was going through a messy divorce, he was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he had been skipping shifts at his job. Earlier that month, Greg had come to the farm asking Jack for money. He said his house was about to be foreclosed on. But Jack had decided it was time for some tough love. He drew a line in the sand and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he needed to clean up his act and get back to work. That conversation had turned into a massive fight. Now, Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried he had done permanent damage to his relationship with Greg. He was probably afraid that history was repeating itself. Something similar had happened with Jack's other son, Travis, about 7 years earlier. When Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into an argument that was so bad, Travis packed his bags, moved out, and they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since. 7 years of silence. Linda thought Jack must be terrified that the same thing was about to happen with Greg. So, while Jack stood at the sink, scrubbing the grease from his hands, Linda came up behind him and gently rubbed his shoulders. She told him not to worry so much about Greg. She said Greg had a good head on his shoulders and just needed a little push to get back on the right track. That's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right decision and that Greg would get through this rough patch. After that, Linda set the table and called everyone for dinner. A little while later, after they had all eaten and cleaned up the kitchen, Linda glanced up at the clock. She realized it was getting pretty late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and cranky. So she picked him up and carried him upstairs to his room to get him ready for bed. She helped him change into his pajamas, brushed his teeth for him, and then tucked him into his bed. She gave him a kiss on his forehead, whispered good night, and quietly closed the door behind her. Linda went back downstairs. Before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. A short time later, Linda was in their bedroom. She had a small lamp on. She changed into her own pajamas and crawled under the covers. Once Jack was settled in beside her, she reached over and turned off the light, and the room went dark. Soon, they were both fast asleep. But several hours later, in the middle of the night, Linda was jolted awake by a horribly loud noise. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked around the dark room, trying to figure out what had happened. When her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she saw something that made her gasp. The next morning, at a church just a mile away from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting her classroom ready for the day. As the children started to arrive, she noticed there was one empty chair. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. This wasn't totally unusual. She knew Damien's great-grandparents were busy people. They ran a farm, a pizza shop, and a car restoration business. She figured they were probably just running a little behind schedule. So she started the class as usual, hoping they would drop Damien off before he missed too much of the day. About an hour later, around 9:30 in the morning, she was leading the class in their morning sing-alongs. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open and Damien came sprinting inside. At first, the teacher was just relieved to see him. But then she got a closer look. Damien looked frazzled and he was out of breath. He wasn't wearing his backpack. He was still in his pajamas. And there was a smear of something dark and brown on the front of his shirt. She immediately ran over to him and knelt down. As she got closer, she realized the brown spot on his shirt was dried blood. The teacher's heart sank. She gently asked Damien what was going on. He looked up at her with a scared and confused expression on his little face. He told her that his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes after that, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker and his partner were driving their patrol car down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective with the Darker County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was the head of the investigative unit. When the department got a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was the one sent out to see what was going on. The preschool teacher on the phone had sounded frantic. She said a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had shown up for school alone, covered in what looked like blood, and was saying something bizarre about his great-grandparents' faces melting. The teacher gave the police the names of the great-grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, and their address. Whitaker had no idea what a 4-year-old boy could have meant by that strange phrase, or what kind of scene he and his partner were about to walk into, but he had a very bad feeling about it. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel driveway. When Whitaker got out of his car, the first thing he noticed was how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more scattered on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by nothing but empty fields. It felt completely isolated. Whitaker started walking towards the front of the farmhouse. As he got closer, he saw that the front door was already wide open. He didn't see any obvious signs of a forced entry, like a kicked-in door or a broken lock, but it was still unsettling. Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons. They stepped carefully over the threshold and into the house. Whitaker called out, announcing their presence, asking if anyone was home. But there was no response. The only sound was the wind whistling through the open door. From where he was standing in the entryway, he could see another open door across the room. It led to a set of stairs going down, probably to a basement. Whitaker decided to ignore the basement for now and focus on clearing the main floor first. He and his partner moved cautiously through the house. They went into the kitchen. It was empty. Once they were sure it was clear, they continued down a hallway until they found a doorway that led into a bedroom. Whitaker pushed the door open and stepped inside. And that's when he found them. Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, were lying in their bed side by side. It was obvious from the moment he saw them that they were both dead. Jack was lying on his stomach. Whitaker could immediately see a large dark wound on the back of Jack's neck. It looked like a bullet wound. Linda was lying on her back. She had gunshot wounds on her face and on her hand, as if she had raised her hand in a last desperate attempt to defend herself just before she was shot. At this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full, systematic search of the rest of the house just to make sure the killer wasn't still hiding somewhere inside. The house was empty. So the two of them returned to the master bedroom to begin the difficult task of processing the crime scene. Whitaker pulled on a pair of latex gloves and gently touched the wound on Linda's face. The blood was still warm and wet to the touch. Based on that, he figured they had likely only been dead for a few hours at most. He scanned the floor around the bed, looking for bullet casings. He couldn't find any. This told him something important. It meant the killer had been careful. They had taken the time to pick up the spent casings afterwards to cover their track. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to something strange. There was a weird, plasticky bundle lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker carefully picked it up. It was a piece of quilting fabric that had been wadded up into a ball and then covered in layers of masking tape. He turned it over in his gloved hands. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer had probably taped it to the end of their gun to try and muffle the sound of the gunshots. It must have been blown off when they started firing. This immediately raised a question in Whitaker's mind. If this was a silencer, why would a killer even need one? They were out here in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbors were far away, but then he remembered who else was in the house. He left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs. The room directly above where the murders had taken place was another bedroom. This one was filled with stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And that's when it clicked for Whitaker. The killer must have known there was a toddler sleeping right upstairs. They needed the silencer because they didn't want to wake the child when they committed the murders. And this meant one thing for sure. The killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was personal. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office arrived and began to swarm the property. Whitaker went back outside to supervise them as they set up a perimeter and started their search for evidence. Pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over. They had found a set of footprints in the soft mud near the side of the house. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints, which led them around the side of the house to a small basement window. The window pane had been carefully pried off, leaving an open hole just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and peered through the opening. Inside, he could see a set of stairs leading up to the main floor of the house. This had to be how the killer got inside. It also explained why that basement door had been standing wide open when they first entered the house. This discovery only made Whitaker more certain that the killer was someone close to the family. They obviously knew the layout of the house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a plaster cast of the footprints. With any luck, it would tell them the type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. As Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that ran along the side of the house had been cut. The wire was cleanly severed. The killer had planned this meticulously. They had made sure that no one inside the house would be able to call for help. Just then, a pickup truck pulled up at the end of the road. A woman got out and started walking hesitantly toward the house. Whitaker quickly walked over to intercept her, making sure she didn't get too close and contaminate the crime scene. He asked her what she needed. She explained that she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said she had seen all the police cars and didn't know what was going on, but she thought she had some information that might be helpful. The neighbor told Whitaker that around 4:30 that morning, she had been awake and had seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been too dark for her to see the color of the minivan, but the vehicle itself had stuck out in her memory. As far as she knew, the Myers family did not own a minivan. Hearing this, Whitaker realized this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. If that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened sometime before 4:30 in the morning. This was a potentially huge piece of the puzzle. He thanked the neighbor for her help. After she left, Whitaker went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to figure out a motive. He was convinced that whoever did this knew Jack and Linda, but that didn't explain why. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was it revenge for some old grudge? He didn't know. As he walked through the house, he found that deposit bag full of cash that Linda had brought home. It was sitting in plain sight in the living room. It hadn't been touched. There were also some expensive electronics in the living room, a TV, and a stereo system that were also untouched. This pretty much ruled out robbery as a motive. So Whitaker went back upstairs to take another closer look at the toddler's bedroom. As he scanned the room, he noticed something odd. On the child's bedding, there was a small reddish-brown stain. It looked like a spot of dried blood. While forensics teams were still carefully combing over every inch of the farmhouse, another investigator on the case, a man named Detective Mike Burns, drove to the local preschool. His task was to speak with the only potential witness, 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate wave of sympathy for this little boy who was sitting in a small office looking scared and utterly confused. He knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for Damien to talk about something so traumatic, but he was their best hope of figuring out what had happened to his great-grandparents. Burns sat down on the floor with Damien in a private room. He spoke in a soft, calm voice and asked the little boy to try and explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in the simple way that a 4-year-old talks, said he had woken up around 8:45. The house was very, very quiet. So he got out of his bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. He said they were both in their bed, and at first, he just thought they were sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. Then he saw that there was blood on their faces. He said he tried to wipe the blood off with some Kleenex wipes, but there was just so much of it. He realized then that something was very, very wrong. He said he thought for a moment that their faces were melting. And so, thinking he needed to get help for them, he had run the entire mile down the road to his preschool. Burns was amazed that a child so young could remember and articulate so much about such a horrifying experience. He was also grateful. The boy's story explained why there was blood on his pajama shirt. But it still didn't explain the small spot of blood they'd found on Damien's own bed. So, Burns asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room at any point after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien shook his head and said no. He said he went straight out the front door and ran to his school. Burns felt like there had to be more to the story. He just couldn't explain how that bloodstain got onto Damien's bed. So, he brought over a dollhouse and some small toy figures. He asked Damien if he could act out everything that had happened the night before, using the toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien took the toy that represented himself and put it into a bed in one of the dollhouse rooms. Then he put the Jack and Linda toys into the bed in the other room. He said that everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtime. But then, he said, later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open. He said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. Damien paused for a long moment, and then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just describing a nightmare or if his imagination was running wild. But then, Damien put the toys down. To represent the green monster, he used his fingers, and he made them crawl across the floor of the dollhouse, moving slowly toward his own bed. Damien explained that he had heard the door to his room open, and he had opened his eyes just a tiny bit. He didn't want whoever it was to know he was awake, so he was just squinting. And when he did that, he saw the green monster standing right next to his bed, and the green monster was pointing a gun at him. Damien said he was so scared that he squeezed his eyes shut as tight as he could and just pretended to be asleep. And then, when he finally dared to open his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's memory was almost certainly not a dream. It was all too real. More than likely, Damien had come face to face with the person who killed his great-grandparents. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, a 19-year-old named Amber Holscher. So, the detective drove out to Amber's house in a nearby town. When he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. At this point, no one in the family had been officially notified about the murders, so Amber had no idea why a detective was suddenly standing on her doorstep. Burns knew this would be difficult, so he gently asked if he could come inside to speak with her. Confused, Amber said, "Okay," and let him in. They sat down in her living room. Then Burns told her as gently as he could that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. When Amber heard this, she just looked confused. She asked what he meant. "Where are they?" she asked. Burns took a deep breath and had to clarify that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked. Her eyes filled with tears, and the first thing she asked was, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns quickly reassured her. He told her that Damien was alive and safe, but that he was going to be kept in protective custody for a while. They were worried that whoever killed Jack and Linda might try to hurt Damien too. And until they had a suspect, Damien would not be allowed to see anyone in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just broke down and started to cry. Burns felt terrible for her, but his main focus was on Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible. Every day that went by was another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based on Amber's genuine shock and her immediate concern for her son, Burns felt it was highly unlikely that she was involved. Damien also hadn't mentioned seeing his mother at the farmhouse, but she might know something that could help them. Once she had calmed down a bit, Burns asked her if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. Right away, she nodded. She mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because Linda wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, she said, just recently, Andrew had shown up at Linda's pizza shop and had started a big fight with her about custody. The argument had gotten so heated that Andrew had publicly threatened to kill Linda. This immediately caught Burns's attention. It provided a clear and powerful motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, Andrew would have a much easier time getting custody of Damien, so he thanked Amber for her help and promised he would be in touch soon. The moment he got back to his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and told him what he had learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew came to the door and let them inside. He sat down and looked at them, waiting for them to explain why they were there. They told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered, and they watched his reaction very closely. He seemed surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset or sad. Andrew openly admitted that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about the big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew didn't deny it. He admitted that he had, in fact, threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do something like that. He said it was just an empty threat made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew seemed very suspicious. So, he asked him for an alibi for the night of the murders. Andrew said he had stayed over at a girl's house that night. In the morning, he had stopped by his dad's house, and then he had gone straight to work. He told them they could ask all of those people, and they would all confirm his story. Whitaker wrote all of this down. He asked Andrew a few more questions and then thanked him for his time. As soon as the detectives left Andrew's house, they immediately went to go check on his alibi. They drove to the girlfriend's house. Then they went to Andrew's dad's house. And finally, they went to his place of work. And every single person at all 3 locations confirmed Andrew's story. His alibi was solid. Unless all of them were lying, there was simply no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours to Ohio, murdered Jack and Linda, and then driven back. Whitaker was disappointed. They had basically wasted most of the day chasing a lead that now looked like a dead end. And he was very aware that every moment this case went unsolved was another moment that little Damien had to spend all alone away from his family. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and his mother, was sitting in his office feeling very frustrated. He had one main goal for the day. He wanted to find and interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was proving to be much harder than he had anticipated. The day before, other sheriff's deputies had interviewed Linda and Jack's family and friends. Several family members had mentioned that Travis and his father Jack had some very bad blood between them. When Burns had looked into Travis's background, he found that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a big problem. It seemed like Travis hadn't even been in the state of Ohio for the last 7 years. The last anyone in the family had heard, he had moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually had no idea where Travis was. There was no other address on record for him. So, Burns basically had no way of finding him. He decided his best bet was to start by visiting Travis's younger brother, Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he wasn't sure how close the two brothers were, it was the only lead he had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a young man in a baseball cap opened the door. It was clear from his red, swollen eyes that he had been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers. The young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg didn't seem surprised by the visit at all. He said the police had already called him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murders. He said that since then, he'd just been waiting for an officer to come by and talk to him. He said he'd seen enough TV shows to know that family members were always the first suspects. But as they walked into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks. There was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was. Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He had come here hoping to maybe get a lead on where Travis might be. He never imagined he would just find Travis standing right there in Greg's house. This was a huge development. Until this moment, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg explained that Travis had actually been in Ohio for the past several weeks. He had been staying in an apartment he had rented nearby. Burns thought the timing of this seemed incredibly suspicious. It was just too convenient that Travis had come back to town for the first time in almost a decade, right before his estranged father and stepmother were killed. It just seemed too perfect. And something about the scene just felt off. The two brothers just standing there waiting for the police to come and question them. It didn't sit right with him. So Burns, acting on a gut instinct, told them both that he needed to question them formally. He said they would have to come with him down to the station. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns led Greg and Travis Myers into the Darke County Sheriff's Office. Neither of the brothers was under arrest yet, but Burns had a strong feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them might be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while his partner took Travis into an interview room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down, Burns noticed that he wasn't making any eye contact. He was fidgeting and acting shifty. But Greg quickly said that he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted to know if it could help them solve his dad and stepmother's murders. So Burns began asking questions. He asked Greg where he was in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. Greg told him that he was mostly just asleep. That is, until about 4:30, when he got up to go to his job at a factory a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the entire night, and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan. He clocked in at 5:23 in the morning, and he even had a signed time card at home that would prove it. Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. Remember, the neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 that morning, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi was a little shaky, the timing alone seemed to rule him out. It seemed basically impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4:30, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive all the way to the factory, and still be able to clock in by 5:23. There just didn't seem to be enough time to do all of that. Also, pretty much everyone in the family had told Burns that Greg was actually quite close with Jack and Linda. Yes, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So, even though Greg was still technically a suspect, Burns decided to shift his focus to Travis. Burns asked Greg how Travis had reacted when he heard about the murders. Greg said Travis had been upset, but he had mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, since Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken. He said those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that big falling out between Jack and Travis. Greg said it all came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money. They had a huge argument that got really ugly. After that, Travis had just quit the family business and moved away. Burns thought about this. He wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if he did, that would certainly be a solid motive for murder. So, Burns made two mental notes. First, check into Greg's alibi more thoroughly. And second, look into Jack's will to see how his assets were supposed to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left. He went right down the hall and waited outside the room where his partner was questioning Travis. Later, Burns's partner told him that Travis had seemed really nervous from the moment he stepped into the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing back in Ohio. Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently and realized he had never actually met his brother Greg's children. So, he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then, the detective asked him what he was doing at the time Jack and Linda were killed. Travis stuttered and said he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked if he had anyone who could confirm that. Travis hesitated for a moment and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car. Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car. It was a white minivan. After getting the summary from his partner, Burns went back to his office. By this point, Greg had been moved to a different room. Burns sat down at his desk and began going over the evidence they had collected so far. The investigation had been moving very quickly, so there actually wasn't a whole lot of physical evidence processed yet. It had only been 24 hours since the forensic evidence had been sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on just about everything. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited was to follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. They were the victim's sons, he already believed the killer was close to the family, and they both drove minivans. Really, either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns's office phone rang. He picked it up. It was a local man who said he had seen a news report about the murders of Jack and Linda Myers. And he had some information that he thought might help. The man said that a few days earlier, a friend of his had called him to ask if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man asked his friend why he needed a gun, the friend said it was because he, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man on the phone told Burns the name of his friend who had said this, and as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who the murderer was. Based on that crucial phone call, as well as the forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of the 27th of March 2003. Early that morning, the killer woke up, got out of bed, and immediately put on a green hunting jumpsuit. They also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun they had purchased from a classified ad just 2 days earlier. They carried all of their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove a familiar route through the dark, open fields of the countryside. They were calm at first, but as they turned onto the long gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm, their heart began to race. The killer felt like they had planned everything out perfectly and had prepared for anything that could possibly go wrong. So now, all they had to do was control their nerves and stick to the plan. The killer parked right outside the farmhouse. Then, while still sitting in the car, they climbed into the backseat of the minivan and grabbed their shotgun. They took a piece of thick quilting fabric, wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun, and used masking tape to secure it in place. This was their do-it-yourself silencer. But as they did this, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous. As much as they had planned for this moment, it really wasn't something they wanted to do. But they felt like they had to. After their gun had its silencer, they slung it over their shoulder. They got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. Once they were there, they cut the phone lines, making sure nobody inside could call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt, pried open the basement window, and climbed inside. Once inside the dark basement, the killer walked to the stairs. They went up to the first floor and walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. they went inside. There they were, sleeping in their bed. The killer took a deep breath and then raised the shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot was too strong for the homemade silencer. It blew right off. So the shot wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud. The silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. From the chaos, Linda sat bolt upright in bed. She looked straight at the killer and saw what was happening. She instinctively raised a hand to try and defend herself. In a moment of sheer panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her. They fired twice. One blast went through her hand. The other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and listened. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the next two were incredibly loud. They knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person they knew was in the house. A person they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure there were no loose ends, they left Linda in Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. They went inside, carefully walked over to the boy's bed, raised their shotgun, and aimed it at the child, waiting to see if he was awake. But the little boy appeared to be sound asleep. And so, the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and backed out of the room. Once they were back in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and hurried right out of the house. From there, they got back in their minivan and sped off into the darkness. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their bloody clothes into a river. Then, they changed into their work clothes and drove to the factory, where they clocked in at precisely 5:23 in the morning. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having serious problems with money and drug abuse. His father, Jack, had refused to bail him out, and they had been fighting about it. Greg knew that he would inherit the farm if his father died. And he was so desperate, he decided that murder was his only option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23. His alibi was just barely possible. Greg was arrested about 48 hours after the crime. The investigation moved so quickly that police were still gathering evidence to use against him even after he was in custody. They later found the shotgun, the other supplies, and a pair of shoes that matched the prints found in the mud outside the house, all in a river right near the farm. Fingerprints and store receipts tied all of the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he went to live with his mother, Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now grown up and doing very well. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In March of 2015, in the sprawling, historic city of St. Petersburg, Russia, a 8-year-old woman named Tamara Samsonova was living in a state of controlled chaos. Her apartment, the place she had called home for years, was being torn apart and put back together. Renovations. Dust was everywhere, the noise was constant, and it was becoming nearly impossible to live there. A good friend of hers, a 9-year-old woman named Valentina Olenova, heard about Tamara's situation. Valentina lived nearby and had a spare room. She felt for her friend and decided to make a generous offer. She called up Tamara and said something along the lines of, "Why don't you come and stay with me while the work is getting done?" "It's no trouble at all." Tamara was immensely grateful. It was the perfect solution. She immediately accepted, packed a few bags, and moved into Valentina's quiet, comfortable apartment. From the moment she arrived, Tamara wanted to be the perfect houseguest. She knew she couldn't afford to pay rent, so she decided to contribute in other ways. She became the unofficial housekeeper. She cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, she did all the dishes, and she made sure there was always a home-cooked meal ready for Valentina. For the first couple of weeks, things were wonderful. The two women, both in their later years, enjoyed the companionship. They'd chat in the evenings, share meals, and it felt like a comfortable, easy arrangement. Valentina was happy to help her friend, and Tamara was relieved to be out of her noisy, dusty apartment. Then, after a few weeks passed, Tamara got a call. The renovations on her home were complete. It was time for her to move back. But a strange thing had happened. Tamara had gotten used to living with Valentina. She enjoyed the company, she enjoyed their routine, and frankly, she didn't want to leave. So she approached Valentina and asked, would it be okay if I stayed just a little bit longer? I'm really enjoying it here. Valentina was a little hesitant. The original agreement was just for the duration of the renovations. But she was a kind woman, and she didn't want to just kick her friend out onto the street. So she reluctantly agreed. Okay, she said. A little bit longer is fine. But a little bit longer turned into a couple of months. Spring turned into summer, and Tamara showed absolutely no signs of packing her bags or making any plans to move back to her own apartment. Valentina's patience began to wear thin. Her home didn't feel like her own anymore. The temporary guest had become a permanent fixture, and the initial harmony had curdled into a quiet, simmering resentment. Valentina started dropping hints, asking about Tamara's apartment, wondering aloud when she might be moving back. But Tamara would just brush off the questions or change the subject. Finally, in late July of 2015, Valentina couldn't take it anymore. She decided a direct confrontation was the only way. She sat Tamara down and told her straight up, you have to go. The renovations are done. It's time for you to go home. She expected some resistance, maybe some sadness, but she didn't expect Tamara's flat-out refusal. Tamara just looked at her and said, no, I'm not leaving. This sparked a huge fight. Voices were raised, feelings were hurt, and the tension in the small apartment became unbearable. But at the end of it all, nothing was resolved. Tamara still refused to leave. For the next couple of days, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the apartment. The two women moved around each other like ghosts, not speaking, not even making eye contact. The air was thick with unspoken anger. This Cold War was finally broken on July 23rd over something incredibly trivial. There were a few unwashed cups left in the sink. One of them was supposed to have cleaned them, but hadn't. An argument started about whose turn it was to do the dishes. But of course, it wasn't really about the cups. It was about everything else. The argument quickly escalated, and soon, Valentina was screaming at Tamara again. You shouldn't even be here. You need to leave my home! And Tamara was yelling back, no, I'm not going to leave. It was another huge blowout fight filled with bitterness and frustration. But then, something shifted. As the yelling died down, Tamara's demeanor changed. She seemed to finally accept the situation. With a sigh of resignation, she looked at Valentina and said, okay, I get it. I need to leave. Just give me a couple of days to get my things in order and I'll be out of your hair. Instantly, all the tension just evaporated from the room. Valentina felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, she was going to get her apartment back. The fighting was over. To seal the truce, Tamara offered a peace offering. Look, she said, I'll make us a special dinner tonight. I'll go out and get the food. Tamara left the apartment, but she didn't go straight to the grocery store. Her first stop was a local pharmacy. She walked in and bought a large quantity of potent sleeping pills. Then she went to the market and bought all the ingredients for a traditional Russian Olivier salad, a dish she knew was one of Valentina's absolute favorites. She returned to the apartment and began to prepare the meal. The kitchen was quiet as she chopped vegetables, but her mind was anything but. She took the sleeping pills she had just purchased, and using a mortar and pestle, she crushed them into a fine white powder. Then, as she was mixing the mayonnaise-based dressing for the salad, she carefully stirred the powder in, making sure it was completely dissolved and undetectable. She served the dinner, and Valentina, hungry and happy that their conflict was resolved, ate the entire salad. She didn't notice anything wrong. The dressing was rich and creamy, just the way she liked it. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had finished every last bite, she simply cleared the plates, went up to her room, and went to bed, leaving her friend in the living room. She waited. A couple of hours later, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Tamara quietly got out of bed. She crept downstairs to the kitchen. And there, on the floor, was Valentina, passed out cold. Tamara walked over and checked for a pulse. She was still breathing. For a moment, Tamara felt a flash of disappointment. She had hoped the massive overdose of sleeping pills would have been enough to kill her. But it didn't really matter. It just changed the next step of her plan. She went to a closet where she had stashed a hacksaw. She had borrowed it from a neighbor earlier that day under the pretense of needing it for a small project. Now, she brought it back to the kitchen. Standing over her unconscious friend, Tamara began the gruesome, laborious task of dismembering Valentina's body. She worked with a strange, methodical precision. As she cut her friend into pieces, she took special care to remove the lungs, making sure not to damage them. It turns out, human lungs were a particular delicacy for Tamara. She considered them her favorite food. Once the body was in several pieces, she took Valentina's head and placed it into a large stock pot on the stove. She filled it with water and turned on the burner, beginning to boil it. While the head and the carefully preserved lungs cooked, she took the rest of Valentina's remains. She cut them into the smallest pieces she could manage, then wrapped them in a shower curtain and stuffed them into various plastic bags. The process was long and physically demanding, but Tamara worked tirelessly through the early morning hours. With Valentina's head and lungs simmering on the stovetop, Tamara began the disposal. She started making trips, dozens of them, from the apartment high speed, down the stairs, and out the front door into the dark, silent streets of St. Petersburg. She carried the heavy bags one by one all the way down to a small lake near their apartment building, where she tossed them into the dark water. Back and forth she went, trip after trip, until most of the body parts were gone. Valentina's hips and legs, however, were apparently too heavy for her to carry all the way to the lake. So, for those, she took a different route, dragging them to a nearby patch of forest and leaving them there. Her final trip was perhaps the most macabre. She carried the big silver pot from the stove. Inside was what was left of Valentina's head, after Tamara had finished eating most of it. 4 days passed. Life in the apartment building went on as normal. Then, on July 27th, a young couple who lived in the same building as Tamara and Valentina decided to take their dog for a walk near the lake. As they strolled along the path, their dog suddenly took off running. It stopped in front of a large, bulky plastic bag that had washed up near the shore. The dog began sniffing and pawing at the bag, trying to get it open. The couple called for their dog, but it wouldn't budge. It was completely fixated on the mysterious package. Annoyed, the owners walked over to see what had captured their pet's attention. The man poked the bag with his foot. It was heavy, and it felt wrong. With a sense of dread, he managed to tear it open. Inside, they found a human torso. It was Valentina's. When the police arrived, one of the first things they did was canvass the apartment building to see if anyone was missing. They quickly learned that the victim was likely Valentina Olenova. They went to her apartment to investigate and were surprised to find Tamara Samsonova living there. They approached her gently, assuming she was a grieving friend or relative. They explained that Valentina had been found deceased and that they needed to search the apartment as part of the investigation. Tamara's reaction was completely bizarre. She was totally indifferent. There was no sadness, no shock, no fear. She just calmly allowed them in, as if she knew this day would eventually come. The search of the apartment didn't take long. The officers quickly found what they were looking for. There were specks of blood all over the bathroom. There was more blood in the kitchen. They found the hacksaw she had used, still bearing traces of blood and tissue. And then they found her diary. It was sitting on a table right next to a book about black magic and the occult. When the police opened the diary, they were horrified. It wasn't just a daily journal. It was a meticulous, detailed log of ritualistic killings that Tamra had apparently been carrying out for the past 20 years. The diary described 14 different murders. According to her own writings, almost all of the killings were motivated by her desire to cast spells she was learning from her books on black magic. These spells, she wrote, required specific human components like flesh or organs. So she would kill people, use their bodies for her rituals, and then afterwards she would consume parts of them. Not because the spell required it, but simply because she said she liked the taste of human flesh. And in particular, she noted, she loved the taste of human lungs. The police arrested Tamra on the spot. She didn't put up a fight. She didn't deny anything. She looked at the officers and said, "Yep, you got the right person. I did all this." During her trial, Tamara's behavior was a spectacle. She seemed to be in a great mood, often smiling. She told the judge, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." She was seen blowing kisses to the reporters in the courtroom gallery. It was as if she was completely detached from the reality of her horrific crimes, or perhaps she simply didn't care anymore. Tamara, who the press quickly nicknamed the Granny Ripper, was found guilty and given a life sentence. To this day, she remains in a high-security prison, one of Russia's most notorious and chilling serial killers. After spending 21 years serving in the U.S. Army, a man retired and decided to move his family to Central Florida. He, his wife, and their young son settled into a quiet life. They had plenty of money. He had his military pension coming in every month, and his wife still worked a full-time job. But after a lifetime of structure and activity in the military, he found retirement to be incredibly boring. He just wasn't the type to sit around the house all day. So, he decided he needed to find a simple job, something to keep him occupied and give him a reason to get out of the house. He ended up taking a job as a clerk at a gas station located right off a major highway. One of the main reasons he chose this particular job was because the owners were very laid back. They didn't mind if his son came to hang out with him during his shifts. So, for years, that became their routine. The man would work his shifts behind the cash register, and his son would tag along. Even as the boy grew into a teenager, when you'd think he'd want to be off with his friends, he still came along. The town they lived in was so small and quiet, there was really nothing else for him to do. So even well into his teenage years, the son would spend his evenings at the gas station with his dad. One night in 1990, the son, who was 15 years old at the time, was taking a break. He was sitting outside at a picnic table under the bright lights of the gas station's canopy. He was reading a magazine and drinking a Mountain Dew. It was a dark, quiet night. There were no cars at the pumps, no customers inside the store, and the highway itself was mostly empty. It was in this stillness that he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, a woman, was walking off the shoulder of the highway, heading directly toward the gas station. This immediately struck him as odd. He thought to himself, "No one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here." His logical conclusion was that her car must have broken down nearby, and she was coming to use their payphone to call for a tow truck. The woman continued walking across the large, empty parking lot, getting closer and closer. The boy had turned his attention back to his magazine for a moment, but he would say later that he kept looking up, keeping an eye on her. There was just something about her, something that felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The woman walked right past the picnic table where he was sitting, not even acknowledging him. She didn't say hi, didn't make eye contact, just walked straight to the glass door and went inside the convenience store. From where the boy was sitting, the front of the store was all glass windows, so he had a clear view inside. He could see his father standing behind the counter, and he could see the top of the woman's head as she began to walk up and down the aisles. As soon as she was inside, the boy put his magazine down and just watched. He noticed she wasn't really shopping. She would walk down an aisle, look down at the shelves for a few seconds, but never pick anything up. Then she would look up towards the counter and just stare at his father for a moment, before looking back down and moving to the next aisle. She did this over and over, circling the small store. At some point, the woman seemed to abandon this pretense of shopping and just walked directly up to the counter. There was still nobody else in the store, and the night was so quiet that the boy could fairly clearly hear her conversation with his father. He heard her tell his dad that her car had broken down and she needed a ride. Could he drive her to Ocala? That was the next big town north of their gas station. The boy would say later that his father's reaction was very strange. Normally, his dad was incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He was chatty and friendly with everyone who came in. But with this woman, his dad's tone was dismissive, almost rude. When she asked for a ride, he just gave a short, flat answer. No, I won't give you a ride. The woman was visibly annoyed by how quickly he had shut her down. But instead of just taking no for an answer, she did something strange. She turned and looked out the window, directly at the boy sitting on the picnic bench. He was looking right back at her. She pointed at the boy and said to his father, "What about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride?" The boy saw his father, who was out of the woman's direct line of sight, look at him and shake his head no very firmly. It was a clear signal. Whatever she wants from you, you say no. The boy was confused by all this. He was still trying to understand why his dad was being so hostile and unhelpful. The woman clearly needed help, or at least she claimed to. But he trusted his dad's judgment. He knew that if she came outside and asked him directly, he would say no. But it never came to that. The boy's father said to the woman in a firm, final tone, "No, my son is not going to give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not going to help you." The woman exploded in a fit of rage. She started cussing him out, screaming at him. She stormed towards the door, slammed it open, and stalked back out into the parking lot. She started cussing at the boy as she passed him. The whole time she was walking away, back towards the dark highway, she kept turning around, flipping them both off and screaming profanities. The father had come out from behind the counter and was now standing next to his son, watching her go. As she disappeared into the darkness, the boy turned to his dad and asked, what was her deal? Why did you not want to help her? The dad just shook his head. I don't know, he said. There was just something off about her. I can't explain it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I just knew she had to go. They didn't talk about it much after that. It was just a weird, uncomfortable encounter on an otherwise normal night. A year went by. The boy was in his room at home one evening when he heard his dad yelling from the living room, a sense of urgency in his voice. Come in here! You have to see this! Look at the TV! The boy ran into the living room, and on the television screen, there was a news report. And on the screen was a mugshot. It was the same woman from the gas station. Her name, the reporter said, was Aileen Wuornos. She was a serial killer who targeted men she met along the highways of Florida. The news report detailed how she would get her male victims to pick her up, often at gas stations, before robbing and killing them. The boy and his father stood there, staring at the screen in stunned silence. The chilling realization washed over them. It's unclear if the boy or his father were intended to be her next victims that night. But by the time she had walked into their gas station, she had already killed 4 men. And following that strange, tense interaction with them, she had gone on to kill 3 more people. One of those victims was found in Ocala, Florida, the very town she had asked them for a ride to. Aileen had been caught, which is why her face was on the news. She was later sentenced to death for her crimes. The boy and his father never forgot that night, the night a serial killer walked into their lives, and a father's unexplainable gut feeling may have saved them both. In the early evening of the 7th of May, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zvonka Telemakaska was in the kitchen of her small apartment in Kisevo, a quiet city in the southeastern European nation of North Macedonia. Kisevo is a peaceful place, nestled at the base of a huge mountain. It's beautiful, but also very remote. It's the kind of town where everybody knows everybody and nothing of real note ever seems to happen. Zvonka worked as a cleaning lady to make ends meet. But on this particular day, she had the day off. She was just relaxing at home, waiting for her adult son, Zoran, to come over for dinner. It was a beautiful, warm spring evening, so Zvonka had the kitchen windows open as she moved about, preparing a simple meal for herself. At some point, her phone rang. She picked it up and answered, hearing the voice of a friend on the other end. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained, panicked. The friend asked Zvonka if she was watching the news or listening to the radio. Zvonka said no and asked why. The friend then told her that there was a breaking news story all over the local channels. There had been a huge, terrible traffic accident right there in their town. And the friend said the reports were saying that Zvonka's son, Zoran, was involved. Zvonka let out a strangled cry. She dropped whatever she was holding, and without a second thought, she turned and ran out the front door of her apartment. As she burst outside, her next-door neighbor, who happened to be outside, saw her emerge looking frantic. The neighbor called out, "Hey, is everything okay?" Zvonka, who was already running towards the main road, just blurted out over her shoulder that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. The neighbor watched as Zvonka ran down the street, turned a corner, and disappeared from sight. Zvonka didn't own a car, so she was literally going to run all the way to the hospital to get to her son. A little while later, that same neighbor heard a knock on their door. The neighbor went and opened it and was completely shocked by who was standing on the doorstep. It was Zvonka's son, Zoran. He didn't have a scratch on him and didn't appear to be hurt in any way. Before the neighbor could even process what was happening, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, asked, "Hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet for dinner, and it's totally unlike her to just disappear without telling me where she was going." The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, trying to make sense of the situation. Then the neighbor asked, "Wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident?" Zoran just looked back at them, completely bewildered. "No," he said. "What are you talking about?" The neighbor then explained what had happened just a short while ago. They told him how his mother had run out of her house in a panic, saying he had been in an accident and that she was running to the hospital. Now it was Zoran's turn to be confused. He pulled out his phone and immediately called the local hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital staff answered, they told Zoran two things. First, his mother was not there. She hadn't been there at all that day. And second, while they had heard rumors about a car accident in town, no victims from any such accident had been brought to the hospital. By the end of the night, Zoran had no idea where his mother was, what had happened to her, or what this whole story about a car accident was about. He did the only thing he could think to do. He went to the police and reported his mother, Zvonka, missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, Zvonka was still missing. The police had no leads, no new information, nothing. On that day, a 5-6-year-old local reporter named Vlado Teneski, who happened to live not far from Zvonka, got a call from one of his confidential sources inside the police department. The source told him something that wasn't yet public information. Zvonka had just been found. And unfortunately, she was dead. Her body, which had been brutally beaten, strangled, and stabbed, had been found wrapped in plastic bags and dumped in an illegal garbage dump not far from the town's football stadium. The source also told Vlado that when her body was found, she still had her valuables on her, which seemed to rule out robbery as a motive. This was the part that puzzled the police. When they had started looking into Zvonka's life, they discovered she was just a poor, elderly cleaning lady. She had no known enemies. It made absolutely no sense that she would be the victim of such a brutal, personal, and violent murder that wasn't financially motivated. Vlado thanked his source for the information and hung up the phone. His source had sounded completely shocked by the murder, but Vlado wasn't so much shocked as he was suspicious. He felt like something about the official story was off. Maybe on the surface, Zvonka was just a poor cleaning lady with no enemies, but maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see. Vlado had no idea, but his reporter's intuition was telling him there was a much bigger story here and it needed to be investigated. Vlado had a reputation in Kosovo for being an aggressive, fearless journalist. He wasn't afraid to dive headfirst into murky stories involving corruption or abuse of power. He would regularly publish articles that were highly critical of the government, the police, or anyone in a position of authority. As a result, over his 30-year career, he had been threatened with violence many times for the things he had written. But even though Vlado knew this Zvonka murder case had the potential to put him in hot water again, he felt it was his duty to get to the truth. Feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, walked out of his house, and made the short walk over to Zvonka's apartment. When he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door. Soon, the two men were sitting in the kitchen, and Zoran was telling Vlado the whole strange story. He told him about the planned dinner, about finding his mom gone, and about the neighbor's bizarre story of her running to the hospital because of a non-existent car accident. As Zoran spoke, Vlado took meticulous notes, asking pointed follow-up questions. By the end of the interview, Vlado felt like he had a pretty good working theory about what had really happened to Zvonka. And the key to his theory was something Zoran had told him about his mother, that she was a cleaning lady. It took Vlado a couple of days to put his story together. He interviewed dozens more people in the neighborhood. Finally, on May 19th, just 3 days after Zvonka's body was found, Vlado published his story in the newspaper. The headline was "Explosive. A serial killer stalks Kosovo." In the article, Vlado argued that Zvonka's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, he wrote, her murder was probably linked to the murders of 2 other women in their town. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Zvonka. Not just in appearance, but in their lives. They were also poor older women who worked as cleaning ladies. This was the connection Vlado had made while interviewing Zoran. When Zoran described his mother, her age, and her profession, Vlado's mind had immediately gone to these other unsolved cases. The other 2 victims were 6-4-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and 5-6-year-old Ljubica Lukaska, who was murdered in 2007. Vlado's story was a bombshell. It was the first time anyone had publicly suggested that a serial killer was operating in their quiet little town. But the story was also explosive for another reason. Vlado was intensely critical of the police. He pointed out that the murders in 2005 and 2007 had been completely mishandled. An arrest had even been made in one of the cases, but clearly, Vlado argued, they had arrested the wrong person because the killer was still out there. When the police read Vlado's story, they were furious with him for his public criticism. However, they also had to admit that Vlado had uncovered a lot of details from his interviews that did seem to point towards the possibility of a serial killer. So, based almost entirely on Vlado's reporting, the police officially linked all 3 murders and began a new, high-priority investigation into a potential serial killer in their midst. But at the same time, Vlado began to notice something strange. He was being followed. Wherever he went in town to do his job, there would be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance, just watching him. Vlado figured this was their way of intimidating him, a form of blowback for his critical article. He just accepted it as part of the job and continued his work. By early June, about 2 weeks after Zvonka's body was found, the police's new serial killer investigation had narrowed its suspect pool from hundreds of people down to just 3. They felt they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, Vlado was still being tailed by police, and the police had not made any public statements about the case. That day, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer. The officer told the editor that they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. As soon as the call ended, the editor tried to phone Vlado to give him the scoop. But Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his phone. The editor also thought it was strange that the police source had called him, the editor, instead of Vlado, the reporter who had broken the story wide open. The editor tried calling Vlado several more times, but he never answered. The editor eventually just assumed that Vlado must have already heard about the imminent arrest from his own sources and was probably already on scene ready to report on it. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Casevo, police had surrounded a modest two-story home. It was overgrown with tall fir trees, and all the windows were covered with heavy drapes. Once the house was completely surrounded, a team of officers walked up to the front porch, knocked loudly on the door, and yelled for whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. For a moment, there was just tense silence. Then, the officers on the porch heard footsteps inside. They readied their weapons. The door slowly opened, and a man, who seemed unthreatening and confused, stepped out onto the porch. The police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper office, Vlado's editor got another phone call. It was the same police officer. This time, the officer was calling to say that the arrest had been made. They had caught their serial killer. Then, he told the editor the name of the person they had arrested. When the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado Tedeschi. It turned out that while Vlado appeared professional and calm on the outside, he was filled with an inner rage, specifically directed at his own mother, who had died in 2002 and who he viewed as a cruel and terrible person. After her death, he became obsessed with getting some kind of twisted revenge on her memory. His method was to find and kill random women who reminded him of his mother, poor, older, and working as cleaning ladies. All three of his victims, Mitra, Lajubica, and Zavanka, had actually known Vlado's mother personally. He had used that connection to gain each woman's trust before luring them to their deaths. Vlado had manipulated the entire narrative. In his explosive newspaper story, he had made things up to throw the police off his trail. For example, he invented a witness who claimed to have seen Zavanka get into a car with two men right before she vanished. That was a complete lie. He was also the one who had planted the fake story on the radio about Zoran's car accident. He had called his former colleagues at the radio station, and they had trusted him and broadcast the story without fact-checking. It was a deliberate, calculated trap to lure Zavanka out of her home. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was his own arrogance. In the very article that made him famous, he included specific details about the crime scenes that the police had never released to the public. For example, Vlado wrote that all three victims had been strangled with telephone cords that were left at the scene. This was a detail only the killer could have known. When the police read that, they immediately became suspicious of Vlado. The police officers who Vlado thought were tailing him to intimidate him were actually tailing him because he was their prime suspect. Eventually, they covertly obtained a DNA sample from him, and it was a match to evidence found at the crime scenes. He was the killer. After his arrest, Vlado was charged with 2 of the murders, and police were preparing to charge him with the 3rd, and were even looking into a possible 4th victim. But on June 23rd, just 3 days after his arrest, Vlado was found dead in his jail cell. The circumstances were bizarre. He had apparently drowned in a small bucket of water. There were 3 other inmates in the cell with him, all of whom claimed they didn't see or hear a thing. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide. And with his death, all of the murder investigations were closed forever. On a late winter afternoon in 1985, a Canadian border security guard stood at his post, watching the line of cars waiting to cross from New York State into Ontario, Canada. As he looked out at the faces of the travelers, he felt a heavy sense of responsibility. His job wasn't just about checking passports and asking about declared goods. It was about being a gatekeeper, about making sure that dangerous criminals from the United States didn't use Canada as a hiding place. And on this particular day, there was one very specific, very dangerous criminal he was on high alert for. His name was Alex Mangal. He was 30 years old. Just a few days earlier, Alex Mangal had been pulled over for a routine traffic stop by a police officer near New York City. During that stop, things had gone horribly wrong. Alex had somehow managed to get the officer's gun, and he had shot the officer in the head, killing him instantly. Alex then fled the scene and had been on the run ever since. Law enforcement on both sides of the border was on high alert. New York was only a 6-hour drive from the Canadian border, and authorities were deeply concerned that Alex would try to slip into Canada to escape. So, an alert had been sent out to all border security personnel. They were to be on the lookout for a 30-year-old white man with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. All day long, that Canadian border guard scrutinized every person who drove up to his checkpoint. He looked closely at every driver, every passenger. He saw a family on their way to visit relatives. He saw a young couple who said they were on their honeymoon. He saw a man whose car was packed to the brim with camping supplies. He saw a middle-aged woman traveling by herself. He saw dozens of different people from all walks of life. But none of them matched the description of Alex Mangal. By the end of his long shift, after checking car after car, he felt confident that the cop killer had not passed through his checkpoint. He clocked out and went home. A few days later, on March 2nd, a police officer was on patrol in a large shopping mall parking lot in Ontario, Canada, about an hour-and-a-half's drive from the border. As he was making his rounds, he noticed a particular car, a white Toyota, that seemed to be just loitering in the area for a long time. His suspicion piqued. He decided to drive over and check it out. As he pulled up alongside the Toyota, he looked inside and saw someone sitting in the passenger seat. It was a white man who looked to be in his 30s, with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. The officer immediately recognized him from the wanted posters. It was Alex Mangal. The officer grabbed his radio and called for backup, then he parked his cruiser, got out, and with his gun drawn, he cautiously approached the white Toyota. As he got closer to the passenger side door, the man inside turned and saw him. In a flash, the man jumped over into the driver's seat, fired up the engine, and the Toyota screeched out of the parking spot, speeding away. The officer sprinted back to his car and took off in pursuit. Within minutes, it seemed like the entire Toronto police force had joined the high-speed chase. They managed to funnel the fleeing car down a dead-end street. The white Toyota crashed into a stop sign, and the man with the mustache and thinning brown hair jumped out. At that point, cornered and with nowhere to go, he gave up without a fight. He was taken into custody. Law enforcement was incredibly relieved to have the dangerous cop killer in custody. But they were also completely baffled. How did Alex Mangal get past border security? Every single guard was on high alert, looking for a man with his exact description. How did he slip through? The police had no answers until they searched the white Toyota that Alex had been driving. Here is what they figured out. On the night Alex shot and killed the police officer, he had fled into a nearby wooded area and hidden there overnight. The next day, he was walking around and happened to pass by a commercial building. He saw a middle-aged woman named Beverly Capone come out of the building and walk towards her car in the otherwise empty parking lot. Alex approached her, abducted her at gunpoint, and forced her to drive to an isolated cabin he knew of deep in the woods. Once they were there, he murdered her. And then, he did something truly monstrous. After she was dead, he stole her clothes and put them on. And then, he cut off her face and her scalp, and he wore them as a mask and a wig. He was literally wearing her skin and her hair. Dressed as a middle-aged woman, he got into her white Toyota and drove the 6 hours north to the Canadian border. He pulled up to the checkpoint, and he got through without anyone giving him a second look. It turned out that the Canadian border security guard, who had been so diligently looking for Alex Mangal all day, had in fact seen Alex Mangal. He just didn't recognize him. Because when Alex Mangal drove up to the checkpoint, he was wearing Beverly Capone's face, her hair, and her clothes. The guard saw what he believed was just a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and he waved him through into Canada. The police pieced this all together when they searched the white Toyota after his arrest. Lying on the floorboard of the car, they found Beverly's dress, her scalp, and her face. Alex was deported back to the United States to stand trial for the murder of the police officer. However, before he could face justice, he attempted to escape from a prison transport vehicle. In the ensuing chaos, he was shot and killed by police. But that wasn't the end of Alex's story. Following his death, investigators continued to look into his past and search his property. During one of these searches, they made a disturbing discovery. They found a collection of photographs of unidentified women, along with several maps of New York and Pennsylvania. On these maps, various isolated remote locations were circled. No one knows what these maps or photos mean. Police have never been able to conclusively link Alex to any other murders, but he remains a person of interest in several unsolved disappearance cases. In fact, many investigators believe that Alex Mangol wasn't just a cop killer. They believe he was actually a serial killer. But because he took all of his secrets to the grave, we will probably never know for sure how many people he actually killed. On the morning of the 2nd of February 2012, a young man pulled his car off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, and into a large, snowy parking lot. He drove past dozens of parked cars until he reached a small, standalone shack that was painted a bright teal color. This was a popular drive-through coffee shop called Common Grounds, and the young man worked there as a barista. After he parked, he walked up to the white employee entrance door, pulled out his key, and went to unlock it. But as he turned the key, he realized the door was already unlocked. He knew the person who had worked the closing shift the previous night. It was an 18-year-old girl named Samantha Koenig. She had only been working at Common Grounds for about a month, but she always seemed very responsible. She had never forgotten to lock up before. The young man shrugged it off. People make mistakes. He pushed the door open and went inside. Right away, he noticed that things seemed out of place. The small kiosk was a mess. It looked like Samantha had just left in the middle of her shift without cleaning up at all. There were napkins scattered on the floor, used towels were left out on the counter, and dirty cups were still sitting by the espresso machine. As the young man walked over to the cash register to get it ready for the morning rush, he tried to run through scenarios in his head that could explain why Samantha had been so sloppy. He reached down with his key to unlock the cash register, and just like the front door, it was already unlocked. He pulled out the cash tray. All the money was gone. And that's when it hit him. They had been robbed. He immediately picked up the phone and called his boss. The night before, Samantha had arranged for her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift ended. Dwayne arrived at the Common Grounds kiosk at around 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift was supposed to be over. He had gotten held up at his own job, which was why he was late. When he pulled into the parking lot, he looked around for Samantha but didn't see her anywhere. The coffee shack itself was completely dark. It looked like it had been closed up for the night. Dwayne got out of his truck and walked through the freezing cold air up to the kiosk's service window. He pressed his face against the cold glass and peered inside, but he couldn't see anyone. His mind immediately went to the fight they'd had earlier that night over text message. She had accused him of cheating on her, and he had been dismissive about it, which had led to a really ugly argument. As Dwayne walked back to his truck, he thought to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight. Maybe she had called her dad or a friend to get a ride home at the end of her shift, and that's why she wasn't here waiting for him. He got back inside his truck and sent a text message to Samantha asking if she was okay and if she had gotten home. But after several minutes passed with no response, his worry started to grow. Even though they were fighting, he cared deeply about her. He decided he had to go by her house just to make sure she was there and that she was safe. A few minutes later, he pulled up to her house and knocked on the door. Her father, James, a single dad, answered. Dwayne explained that he couldn't find Samantha after her shift and was just checking to see if she was home. But James said, "She's not here. I haven't spoken to her. I have no idea where she is." The two men went into James's kitchen and sat down at the table. They both started calling and texting Samantha, trying to figure out where she was. After a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lit up. It was a text message from Samantha's number. The message made it clear that she was still very angry with him. It said that she needed some time to think and that she was going to stay with some friends for a couple of days. It also asked if he, Dwayne, would please let her father know where she was. Dwayne showed the text message to James. Samantha's father read it and immediately felt that something was wrong. This was very uncharacteristic of his daughter. He had raised Samantha on his own since she was 2 years old, and they were incredibly close. They told each other everything. It made no sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say she was going to be with friends. And it made even less sense that she would be ignoring all of his worried phone calls and text messages. The two men stayed up late into the night, calling and texting, hoping for another message from Samantha, but she never responded again. The following morning, with still no word from his daughter, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report. After receiving the report, an Anchorage police officer called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. The owner said that, coincidentally, she had just gotten a call from her morning barista informing her that the kiosk had been robbed overnight and that no one had been able to get in touch with Samantha. The owner told the officer that as soon as she could get the security footage from the previous night, she would send it over to the police. While they waited for the footage, some officers started calling Samantha's friends and family, but no one had seen or heard from her. Other officers went to the Common Grounds kiosk to investigate the scene. They found no signs of a struggle either inside or outside the small building. They also noted that there was a silent panic button located under the counter, which had not been pressed. So, even though Samantha's father felt that her final text message was strange, the police began to operate under the initial theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk herself and had run away. But this theory had problems. What confounded the police was how Samantha would have physically left the area. She didn't have a car that night, and the weather was brutally cold, far too cold to have just walked away. Anchorage isn't a very walkable city to begin with. And if she really was just taking a few days to be with friends, why did none of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop sent over the security footage. The footage, which had no audio, started around 8 p.m. on February 1st, the night Samantha went missing. It showed Samantha inside the kiosk, working alone. She seemed cheerful, busy, serving customers. Then, at some point, someone who is just out of the camera's view comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha turns to them, acknowledges the order, and then turns her back to make the drink. When she finishes, she turns back to the window to hand it to the person, and in that instant, her entire demeanor changes. She immediately steps back and puts her hands up in the air. A few seconds later, she reaches over and turns off all the lights inside the kiosk, plunging the interior into darkness. Then, she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, unmoving, for about a minute. Then, she slowly stands up and walks towards the cash register. She opens it, scoops out all the money, walks back to the window, and appears to hand the cash to a shadowy figure on the other side. Then, Samantha turns and kneels down again, with her back to the window. 2 more minutes pass. Then, the person outside the window leans their entire upper body through the small service window. They reach down and appear to be tying Samantha's hands behind her back. Because it was so dark inside the kiosk, the footage is extremely grainy, making it impossible to identify the person. But it's clearly a male, wearing a large hooded sweatshirt with the hood up and a hat pulled down low over his face. After he's finished tying Samantha's hands, the man leaps entirely through the window, landing inside the kiosk. He then shuts the window behind him. He pulls Samantha to her feet, puts what looks like a gun into her back, and marches her towards the employee door. He leads her out the door, across the snowy parking lot, to a white pickup truck. He puts her inside, and they drive off into the night. Over the next couple of days, the police and the FBI, who were now involved, hit one dead end after another. They had no physical evidence, no fingerprints, nothing. All they had was the grainy surveillance footage that didn't show the kidnapper's face. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, rallied the entire city of Anchorage to help search for his daughter. His passionate efforts attracted national news coverage, and soon Samantha's story was everywhere. Strangers donated thousands of dollars to a reward fund for information leading to her whereabouts. But despite the growing reward and the national media attention, no one came forward with any useful information. And there was still no word from Samantha or her captor. Then, on February 24th, 3 weeks after Samantha had been taken, Dwayne got another text message from her phone. It directed him to a specific sign in a nearby public park. Dwayne and James immediately shared the text with the police and then raced to the park, actually getting there about 15 minutes before the authorities. They walked through the gates, down a main trail, and stopped in front of the sign. It was a community bulletin board, and tacked to the board was a Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a typed ransom note, and Xeroxed onto the note was a black and white photo of Samantha. In the photo, Samantha looked dazed. She had a blank expression on her face, and she wasn't looking directly at the camera, but just off to the side. In the photo, a man's hand was visible, holding up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper, dated the 13th of February, 2012. It was a proof-of-life photo. Her captor was proving that she was still alive as of 11 days ago. For James and everyone involved, this was a small, agonizing bit of relief. At least, she had been alive last week. The ransom note demanded that James deposit $30,000 into his daughter's bank account. If he did, she would be released 6 months later. On the advice of the FBI, James deposited a small portion of the ransom money into Samantha's account. Then, the FBI just waited and watched. They knew that if anyone tried to use her debit card, they could track the location of the transaction. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made from ATMs within Anchorage. Each time, the FBI was notified and rushed to the location, but whoever was making the withdrawals was long gone by the time they arrived. Security footage from the ATMs showed a man wearing a ski mask and large sunglasses, making it impossible to identify him. After those 3 withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week. There was still no word from Samantha. Then, on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but this time they were in Arizona, then Mexico, and then Texas. Again, authorities would rush to the ATMs, but they were always just a few minutes too late. But this time, they got a break. In one of the surveillance videos from a Texas ATM, they spotted the car the masked man got into before he drove away. It was a small white sedan, a Ford Focus, and they saw him get on a highway heading east. An alert was put out to law enforcement in that part of Texas to be on the lookout for that car. On March 13th, a Texas state trooper spotted the white Ford Focus parked in a hotel parking lot. He waited nearby. A short time later, a man in his 30S came out of a hotel room, walked to the car, and got in. The trooper followed him as he pulled out onto the road. He was looking for any reason to pull him over. He clocked the car with his radar gun and saw it was going 2 miles per hour over the speed limit. That was enough. He flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. The trooper walked up to the driver's side window. The man inside was calm. The trooper asked for his license. The man handed him an Alaska driver's license. His name was Israel Keys. He was 34 years old, and he lived in Anchorage. The trooper knew this was their guy. He called for backup, and soon, Keys was in custody. A search of his car turned up a ski mask, clothes that matched the description from the ATM videos, a gun, Samantha's cell phone, and her debit card. After his arrest, Keys initially denied any involvement in Samantha's disappearance. But when presented with the overwhelming evidence against him, he caved. He said he would tell them the whole story of what happened to Samantha, but only if they met his demands: an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers bar, and a cigar. Once the investigators provided these items, he began to talk. And the story he told was so disturbing, so graphically violent, that the FBI has still not released the full transcript of his confession to the public. Here is what happened, based on the details that have been made public. On February 1st, Israel Keys had decided to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting to find a teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He ordered an Americano, but as she turned her back to make his drink, his plan suddenly changed. He wasn't just going to steal money. He was going to steal Samantha. When she turned back and handed him the drink, he pulled out his gun and told her it was a robbery. He forced her to turn off the lights, get on the ground, and hand over the money. Then he tied her hands, jumped inside the kiosk, stuffed napkins in her mouth to keep her quiet, and marched her out to his truck. Once they were in the vehicle, he told her that if she tried to escape or scream, he would kill her. He said she was very obedient and composed, despite being terrified. Keyes then took her phone and sent the text message to her boyfriend, Dwayne, creating the lie that she was with friends. He told Samantha he was holding her for ransom. She told him her family was poor and they wouldn't be able to pay much. Keyes replied, "Don't worry, they'll find a way." He drove around Anchorage for hours, then eventually went back to his own house. He made Samantha lie down in the back seat and covered her with tarps, telling her he would kill her if she moved. Then he went inside his house, where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. He was scheduled to leave with his daughter in just a few hours for a 2-week-long luxury cruise to New Orleans. Keyes went back out to his truck, put a blindfold on Samantha, and led her to a shed in his backyard. Inside, he sat her on a bucket and tied a rope around her neck, anchoring it to the wall behind her so she couldn't move. He cranked up a radio to mask any noise she might make, and told her again that he would kill her if she screamed. He gave her a couple of cigarettes and told her everything was going to be fine, that as soon as he got the ransom money, he would let her go. He turned on a couple of space heaters to keep her from freezing, then he left and locked the shed door. He went back inside, had some wine, and then a little while later went back out to the shed with a cup of water for her. He told investigators that Samantha asked him if he had spoken to her father about the ransom. Keyes lied and said yes, that everything was going according to plan. Then, in a moment of unimaginable cruelty, he untied her wrists and took the rope from around her neck. For a brief second, Samantha must have thought her nightmare was over. But then, Keyes grabbed her and tied her up again, much more tightly this time. He told investigators he just wanted to see the look on her face when she realized she was never going to be let go. He said that as he was tying her up the second time, she had a look of total resignation. She knew what was about to happen. After tying her up, he went back inside one last time to make sure his daughter and girlfriend were still asleep. They were. He went back to the shed. He assaulted Samantha. Afterwards, as he was getting dressed, she looked up at him and asked, "Are you going to kill me?" He said, "Yes, I am." Shortly before 4 a.m., he killed her. He told investigators she never made a sound. After she was dead, he left her body in the shed, went inside his house, and took a shower. Then he woke up his daughter and told her to get ready for their trip. While she was getting ready, he went back out to the shed, rolled Samantha's body in a tarp, and pushed it into a corner. He turned off the heaters and the music, locked the shed, and went back inside to make his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., a taxi picked them up, and they left for the airport to begin their 2-week vacation. When he returned from the cruise, Keyes went back into the shed. He unrolled Samantha's body from the tarp. He then dressed her in new clothes, applied makeup to her face, braided her hair, and then used thread to stitch her eyelids open to make it look like she was alive and alert in a photograph. He held up the newspaper next to her and took the picture that would become the proof-of-life photo in the ransom note. After that, he dismembered her body and dumped the pieces in a frozen lake nearby. It turned out Samantha was not Israel Keyes' first victim. He was a prolific serial killer who preyed on completely random people for the thrill of it. For years, he had been burying kill kits all over the United States. These were caches filled with guns, zip ties, and tools for disposing of bodies. This way, no matter where he was in the country, if he got the urge to kill, he could just dig up his nearest kit and go hunting for a random stranger. He told investigators that the moment he saw Samantha in the coffee kiosk, he knew he was going to kill her. The robbery, the ransom, it was all just an elaborate lie to control her and give her false hope. Keyes admitted to killing Samantha and an older couple in Vermont, but in December of 2012, before he could name any of his other victims, he took his own life in his jail cell. To this day, no one knows for sure how many people Israel Keyes killed. The best guess, based on a drawing of 11 skulls that he made in his cell, is at least 11. But it's just a guess. The true number of his victims is a secret he took to the grave. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 1989, a 22-year-old named Eloise Lindsay set out on a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian wilderness, hoping it would help her figure out what she wanted to do with her life. Instead, the trip would end with Eloise lost in the woods for nearly 3 weeks, convinced that something was following her through the trees. She had just graduated from college, a milestone that for many signals the start of a clear career path. But for Eloise, holding her degree felt less like a map and more like a blank page. She genuinely didn't know what she wanted to do next with her life. Being an experienced backpacker, she felt the call of the wilderness. She believed that a long, solitary journey through nature would give her the time and space she needed to think, to reflect, and to hopefully find some clarity. So she came up with a plan. When Eloise laid out this detailed plan for her parents, they weren't particularly concerned for her safety. They knew their daughter. They knew she was a capable and seasoned backpacker who had successfully completed similar trips before. They trusted her skills and her judgment. So, with their blessing, they wished her well and told her they'd see her when she got back. On November 4th, Eloise shouldered her pack and set out to begin her journey. The first couple of days were exactly what she had hoped for. The weather was beautiful, the autumn scenery along the trail was breathtaking, and the solitude was perfect. She had all the time in the world to be by herself, to look inward, and to think deeply about what her future might hold. But on the morning of the third day, everything changed. She woke up inside her tent, which she had pitched just off the trail the night before, and was immediately hit with an intense, overwhelming sense of dread. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling that she couldn't place. There was no obvious reason for it. She did a mental inventory, trying to figure out what was wrong. Had she forgotten a crucial piece of gear? Was there something about her route she was misremembering? But nothing came to mind. She tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself it was just a strange mood. She decided the best thing to do was to get moving, to pack up her camp and start hiking. She figured the physical activity and the change of scenery would help clear her head. So she unzipped her tent and stepped out into the cool morning air. As she began breaking down her campsite, she casually scanned the tree line. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, it was just a natural habit for a hiker, and that's when she saw it. She could have sworn she saw the figure of a man standing maybe 30 or 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. She blinked, doing a double take, and stared at the spot. It was broad daylight, and she was near a popular trail. The idea of seeing another person wasn't unbelievable in itself. But the way he was standing there, just watching, felt odd. When she looked again, the person was gone. She stood frozen for a minute, her eyes locked on the spot where she'd seen him. Was her mind playing tricks on her? Did she really see someone? If there was another hiker there, why were they hiding? Why wouldn't they just say hello? Out here in the relative wilderness, hikers usually acknowledged each other. But this person never showed themselves again. As she stood there trying to decide what to do, she felt a powerful, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. It was the distinct feeling of being watched. And it felt exactly like the sense of dread she had woken up with inside her tent. A chilling thought entered her mind. Was her intuition, her sixth sense, trying to warn her that she was being observed by a predator? She had no proof, no concrete evidence, but the feeling was undeniable. Alone in the middle of the woods, even an experienced hiker like Eloise couldn't help but feel incredibly vulnerable. The fact that this man, if he was real, wouldn't show himself again made her feel threatened. The feeling quickly escalated into panic. She abandoned any attempt at being neat and orderly and started stuffing her gear into her pack as fast as she could. Her hands were shaking. As soon as her pack was on her back, she took off down the trail, walking quickly away from the campsite and the man she saw in the woods. As she hurried along the path, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right behind her. She kept whipping her head around, her heart pounding, expecting to see someone there. But the trail behind her was always empty. Yet, that visceral feeling of being watched, that deep sense of dread, it just wouldn't go away. Her fast walk turned into a jog, and her jog turned into an all-out run. She realized she was in a very remote section of the trail, miles from any town or road. She was nowhere near her next planned stop. A new thought took hold of her. She had to get off this trail. She had to get to a road, to civilization, to safety, as quickly as humanly possible. She weighed her options. She could stay on the trail, but it would be many more miles and likely take her well into the night before she reached any kind of town. Or she could take a shortcut. She had a map, and she believed there was a road that ran parallel to the trail, but it was far down the mountain. Getting to it would mean leaving the marked path and bushwhacking through dense, unfamiliar wilderness. But the threat of the person or thing she felt was following her was so intense, so real to her, that she couldn't stand the idea of spending another night out in the woods being stalked. So she made a fateful decision. She stepped off the trail and started running straight down the steep, wooded mountainside. It wasn't long before she started to hear actual sounds coming from behind her. She was certain it was the person who was following her. She'd spin around, but there was never anyone there. She'd slow down, trying to listen as she walked, and she'd hear the distinct sound of footsteps in the leaves far behind her. Again, she'd turn and see nothing. But she was absolutely certain someone was back there stalking her. And then came a new sound. It was a low, guttural noise like a deep male voice, but it wasn't a language she could recognize. It was more like a grunt or a yell. Her heart rate soared. She was in full-blown panic now, crashing through the wilderness as fast as she could, praying she was headed towards the road. But after running for miles deep into the middle of nowhere, she hadn't found a road. The sun had set, and it was now completely dark. She knew she was hopelessly lost. She had no choice but to make camp. She knew that somewhere out there in the blackness of the woods was the person or thing that was hunting her. She was all alone, with no way to call for help. This was 1989, long before everyone carried a cell phone. With trembling hands, she set up her tent, crawled inside, zipped it up, and lay there, listening, hoping for silence. But sure enough, within minutes, she started to hear those sounds again. The low, audible grunts from somewhere in the forest. And then, the sound of heavy footsteps, walking in a wide circle around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she heard it. The footsteps never came right up to her tent. There was always some distance, but they were always there. Finally, the sun came up. The moment there was enough light to see, she scrambled out of her tent, packed it up in a frenzy, and started running again, desperately hoping she was moving in the direction of civilization. And all through that day, the terrifying cycle repeated. She had the constant sense that someone was watching her. She heard footsteps behind her, but saw nothing when she turned. She heard that low grunting voice from somewhere in the trees, but could never see who or what was making the sound. As the sun began to set again, she still hadn't found the road. She hadn't found a trail. She knew she couldn't even try to backtrack. If she turned around, she was bound to run straight into the very thing she was trying to escape. So once again, she found a spot to set up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She got inside her tent, and just like the night before, as soon as she was lying down, she heard the heavy footsteps circling in the woods and the low, audible sound that she couldn't place. A couple of days later, the day Eloise was supposed to meet her friend at the 7-day mark, she never showed up. Her friend waited at the rendezvous point for several hours, growing more and more concerned. Finally, when it was clear Eloise wasn't coming, her friend left the trail, found a phone, and contacted the authorities to file a missing person report. The police immediately launched a massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she was supposed to be. For the next 14 days, hundreds of police officers, search and rescue volunteers, and helicopters scoured the area. But they found no sign of Eloise at all. After 2 full weeks of searching, the police had to make the difficult decision to call off the official search. 2 days after the search was terminated, which was now 23 days after Eloise had first set off on her hike, a hunter was out in a remote area near the trail. He stumbled upon Eloise propped up against a tree. She was totally emaciated, severely dehydrated, and delirious, but she was alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter. In her confused state, she thought he was the person who had been following her. But when she finally realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was taken to a hospital, and aside from her severe dehydration and malnourishment, she was physically okay. In multiple interviews and in her official police statement, she detailed her terrifying ordeal. She insisted that she had been chased for nearly 3 weeks through the woods and that she had no idea who it was or why they were chasing her. Then she added another bizarre detail. She said that right before she was found, this person or thing that was following her got so close to her on a couple of occasions that she became absolutely terrified. She was so scared that she made a desperate choice. She ditched her backpack. Her backpack contained all of her life-saving equipment, her tent, her sleeping bag, her food and water. She threw it all away so she could be lighter, so she could run faster. Tapas. You have to imagine the level of fear a person would have to be in to willingly abandon the one thing they need to survive in the wilderness. After ditching her pack, with no supplies, no food, and no water, she stumbled across a tree in the middle of nowhere. And wedged inside a hollow in the trunk was a stash of donuts and pound cake. She took the food, and between that and water from a stream she found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before the hunter found her. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement was just as baffled. Some believe she may have had a mental break, that she got lost, and her paranoia created an imaginary pursuer. Others, including some park rangers familiar with that part of the trail, believe it's possible she was stalked by so-called wild men, feral people who are said to live deep in the mountains, according to local legend. But as of today, there is no official explanation for what happened to Eloise Lindsay. On the 7th of June, 1951, 2 families from Santa Fe, New Mexico, the McGees and the Crosses, decided to spend a beautiful day together. They met up at the Santa Fe ski basin for a picnic to enjoy the fresh mountain air. During the summer months, when there's no snow on the ground, the ski basin is a very popular spot for hikers. The terrain is rugged, and the views from the top are absolutely incredible. But on this particular day, the 2 families just wanted to have a relaxing picnic at the base of the mountain, looking up at the slopes. As the parents began unpacking the car and setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together. There was Larry and Janet McGee, a brother and sister who were 7 and 5 years old, and their friend, 3-year-old Stephen Cross. After they had finished laying out the blanket and the food, the parents looked around and realized the kids were gone. They had just seen them playing nearby only a minute or 2 before, so they figured they couldn't have gone very far. They started looking around, calling out their names, but there was no answer. Their calls became a little more urgent as they began to worry. They expanded their search, looking farther and farther from the picnic spot. They realized the only place the children could have gone was up into the dense woods that bordered the area. But the terrain there was very steep and very rugged. It seemed impossible that 3 young children, one of them a toddler, could have gotten very far up the mountain. And they weren't responding to their parents' calls. A terrible thought began to creep in. Maybe they had been abducted. One of the parents ran to the main building of the ski resort where a staff member was on duty and used the phone to call the authorities. When the police arrived, they immediately set up huge, powerful spotlights and aimed them up at the mountain. The idea was that if the kids had somehow wandered up into the woods and gotten lost, they would see the bright lights and hopefully walk down towards them. After setting up the lights, the police began a thorough search of the mountainside, hoping that the children were simply lost and not the victims of a kidnapping. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers yelling out the children's names, they heard nothing back. They found no sign of the kids. They searched all through the night, and as the hours passed, the grim possibility of an abduction seemed more and more likely. By the following afternoon, things were really starting to look bleak. There was still no sign of the kids anywhere. That's when a searcher, who was way outside of the primary search area, made a startling discovery. He was about 3.5 miles away from the picnic site and thousands of feet up in elevation. He was getting ready to leave his assigned section when he saw something out of the corner of his eye that looked like a person. He turned and saw one of the children poking their head up from behind a large, downed log. The searcher ran over, and sure enough, all 3 kids were huddled together inside the hollow log. They were dirty and scared, but they were all okay. As the searcher was picking them up and radioing in the incredible news, he couldn't help but wonder how in the world these 3 little kids had managed to get so far away and so high up the mountain. Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters, reunited with their tearful parents, and checked over by a doctor who confirmed they were okay, the police asked them the question on everyone's mind, how did you get all the way up there? Larry, the oldest of the group at 7 years old, was the one who answered. It took him a minute, but eventually he said that they had been playing near the picnic area and had wandered just a little way into the tree line. All of a sudden, he said, a bear came out from behind a tree and started chasing them. According to Larry, the 3 of them ran for their lives 3.5 miles up a steep mountain until they found the log, which they jumped inside of to hide. He claimed the bear was patrolling the area looking for them. But then Larry added another detail. He said that in addition to the bear, they were especially scared of the gorilla that was also walking around the area looking for them too. Now, it's easy to dismiss a child's story. You could say the gorilla they saw was just one of the searchers. But there were no searchers in that specific remote area near the log until the exact moment they were found. It was a last-ditch effort to expand the search, and it was a miracle they were located at all. Larry insisted that he and the other kids saw the gorilla and the bear on the first day and during the first night, long before any search teams were that far up the mountain. As for the bear, sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin are rare, but not unheard of. However, if a real bear had been chasing 3 small children, it would have caught them. There's no way 3 kids, especially a 3-year-old, could outrun a bear going uphill. So either there wasn't a bear or it was some other animal that just looked like a bear to them. But even if you discount the animals entirely and say the kids just got lost, there's still the problem of the distance. To cover 3.5 miles uphill through extremely rugged mountain terrain is an incredible feat for a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. For a 3-year-old, it's practically impossible to do in a 2-4-hour period without help. The only way it might be possible is if the children were in absolute fear for their lives. The adrenaline rush from that kind of terror could potentially give them the strength and endurance to cover that distance. This lends a strange credibility to their story that they were, in fact, running for their lives. But what were they running from? A bear? A gorilla? We'll likely never know. Because the children were found alive and safe, the case was closed and everyone moved on. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was a force to be reckoned with in college football. He was arguably one of the most successful college quarterbacks in history, leading his team to 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also known for being one of the toughest players on the field. Most quarterbacks are trained to avoid big hits, to slide, or run out of bounds. Not Cullen. He stood 6'2", weighed 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he actually wanted to get hit and that he would hit back. His coaches hated it, but his teammates loved his fearless, aggressive style. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. During his junior year in college, he broke his collarbone but didn't tell anyone. He played through an entire playoff series with the injury and still led his team to victory. After college, however, Cullen's professional football career didn't reach the same heights. He had brief stints with two NFL teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but he didn't get much playing time. He could see the writing on the wall. He wasn't going to make it in the NFL. So he left for Europe to play in the European Football League. But when that career also began to sputter out around 2009, he came back to the United States and joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. Cullen's passion for the game was still as strong as ever, but he knew that playing at this level meant his career was effectively over. Around the same time he was hanging up his football cleats for good, he met a woman named Jennifer who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player, and in many ways, she was just as competitive and athletic as Cullen. They were a perfect match. They got married in 2010, and Cullen, this big, tough quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar. He was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. It was a huge turning point for him, a moment where he was consciously putting his football past behind him to start a new life and build a family. The newlyweds moved into a house in Michigan, had 2 children, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales. By all accounts, Cullen was thriving in his life after football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family planned a 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan. Cullen and Jennifer decided to join them with their kids. They rented a cabin near the campsite where Jennifer's family was staying. The whole weekend was wonderful. The weather was perfect, everyone was having a great time fishing and relaxing. On May 26th, the last night of the trip, Cullen, who had recently bought a new pontoon boat that he was incredibly proud of, wanted to go out one last time. He just wanted to fish for another 30 or 45 minutes before they packed up and ended the weekend. So Cullen put on his fishing waders and his jacket, grabbed his fishing pole, and had his family drive him to the set of stairs that led down to the water where his boat was docked. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes. He told them to pick him up at the next boat ramp downriver and that he would call them when he was ready. 42 minutes later, at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer's phone rang. It was Cullen. She expected him to say he was ready to be picked up. But when she answered, Cullen's voice was frantic. He told her that he was being followed by 2 men. He said he was out on the water in his pontoon boat, but there were 2 men in the tree line on the shore. He said he couldn't see them, but he could hear them, and they had been following him for some time. Before Jennifer could even process what he was saying and ask a question, Cullen said something incredibly strange. He told her he was going to beach the boat and take his clothes off. Then he hung up. Jennifer immediately tried calling him back over and over, but he didn't pick up. She was left feeling totally shocked and confused. What stood out most to her was the raw fear in his voice. Fear was not an emotion she associated with Cullen. This was a man who was a beast on the football field, who seemed fearless. For him to sound that scared and to be talking about people stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. She immediately called 911, described where he was on the Baldwin River, and the police said they would send someone out right away. After getting off the phone with the police, Jennifer called her family and told them about the bizarre and terrifying phone call from Cullen. Her brother, Matt, decided to try calling Cullen himself. This time, Cullen answered. Matt asked him, "Cullen, where are you?" Cullen replied, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." Matt tried to get more information, asking if he was still on his boat or if he was on land. All Cullen said was, "It's getting pretty rough out here," and then he hung up again. Matt called Jennifer and told her about the call, but it didn't provide any clarity. So Jennifer and her family decided the best thing to do was to drive to the boat ramp where Cullen had originally said he wanted to be picked up. They hoped he might somehow make his way there. When they arrived, Cullen was nowhere to be seen. They got out of their car and yelled his name into the darkness, but there was no response. Shortly after, a police car pulled up. This was one of the locations Jennifer had mentioned to the 911 operator. The police officer took an official statement from Jennifer, and at that point they filed an official missing person report for Cullen Finnerty. Before starting the physical search, the police contacted Cullen's wireless service provider and asked them to ping his cell phone. A service provider can roughly triangulate a phone's location based on which cell towers it's connecting to. The results they got back were bizarre. The last 4 locations that were pinged for Cullen's phone were up to 4 miles apart from each other. This was strange because the idea that Cullen could have covered that much ground, moving 4, 5, or even 7 miles in a short amount of time through very rugged wooded terrain, didn't seem possible. What was even stranger was that when police looked at these 4 points on a map, each one was either right next to a paved road or would have required him to cross a paved road to get there. If he was lost and scared, why would he keep crossing roads, which represented safety, and plunging back into the wilderness? As strange as the data was, it gave the police a solid starting point. They dispatched search teams to each of the 4 locations and also began combing the banks of the river where he was last seen. Within an hour, they found his boat. It was beached on the side of the river, a little ways downstream from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached or had just drifted ashore. Cullen was not in it, and a search of the immediate area found no sign of him. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the boat was found told police he heard screaming or yelling coming from that area around the same time Cullen went missing. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of volunteers searched the areas where his phone had pinged and along the river, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after he went missing, they found his body. He was located less than half a mile from a paved road in an area situated between the 4 cell phone ping locations. He was lying face down, his right arm tucked under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching a handful of grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming from his nose, but other than that, there was no sign of significant trauma anywhere on his body. He appeared to be fully clothed, but investigators noted that the strap on his waders was badly twisted. This was a significant detail. A twisted strap like that would have been very uncomfortable, something a person would almost certainly fix before starting a fishing trip. This, combined with the bizarre statement he made to his wife about taking his clothes off, led some to speculate that at some point during his ordeal, his clothes had come off and had been put back on again in a hurry, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone was found in his front pocket. Cullen's initial autopsy was inconclusive. There was no obvious cause of death. Later, a more detailed analysis determined he had died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. Many people believe Cullen's death was a tragic result of CTE, a brain injury caused by the years of repeated head trauma from playing football. CTE can lead to paranoia and confusion. Perhaps he had a severe paranoid episode, believed someone was chasing him, got lost and scared, and in his panicked state, somehow ended up dying. There was a minor incident in 2011 where Cullen had briefly thought someone was following him, but it had passed. But even if it was a fit of paranoia, why didn't he stop when he reached the paved roads? A road represents help and safety. His instinct should have been to seek help, not to run back into the woods. And why did he leave the safety of his boat in the first place? On the other hand, if he really was being followed, why would his pursuers allow him to make phone calls? Why would they prompt him to take his clothes off? It makes no sense. Both theories are full of holes, leaving a tragic and profound mystery. Thank you so much for watching. What makes stories like these so unsettling is that they don't feel impossible. Even today, people still disappear in forests, national parks, and remote wilderness areas under circumstances nobody can fully explain. And in all three of these cases, the victims described the exact same terrifying feeling that something was following them just beyond the trees. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe out in places where there are no cameras, no witnesses, and no help for miles around, there really was someone or something out there with them. Let me know what you think in the comments. And the next time you find yourself completely alone in the woods and suddenly get the feeling that you're being watched, you might want to trust that feeling. On the evening of the 28th of April 2002, 38-year-old Rhonda Boggs was sitting on the couch in her mother-in-law's house in the small, quiet city of Pascagoula, Ohio. She kept glancing at the clock on the wall, a nervous energy building inside of her. At her feet, her 2.5-year-old daughter, Amanda, was happily playing with a little stuffed animal, completely unaware of her mother's anxiety. It was 6:30 in the evening, and Rhonda's husband, Dave, was scheduled to call any minute. But he wasn't calling from work or from a friend's house. Dave was calling from the county jail, where he was currently incarcerated. He had been sentenced to 2 weeks behind bars, not for anything violent, but for something that to Rhonda felt just as damaging to their family. He had failed to pay child support to one of his ex-girlfriends. And while Rhonda was deeply upset and embarrassed by the whole situation, a part of her knew she really shouldn't have been surprised. This was just who Dave was. When Rhonda had first met Dave about 12 years earlier, she had been completely swept away by his carefree, rebellious personality. He was the lead singer in a local rock band, and she had fallen in love with him while watching him on stage, dancing in the front row at his shows. Back then, it all felt so glamorous and exciting, like a fantasy. It felt like they were going to stay young and wild forever. But now, reality had set in hard. They were both 38 years old, they had a toddler to raise, and a mountain of bills to pay. But Dave, it seemed, just kept on partying and playing the part of a rock star, while all the real-world responsibilities fell squarely on Rhonda's shoulders. She could barely remember the last time she'd gone to one of his shows since Amanda was born. In part, it was because a smoky, loud bar was no place for a baby. But it was also because the crowd Dave hung around with was not the kind of crowd she wanted to be a part of anymore. They were hard drinkers, some were into drugs, and more than a few were ex-convicts. And so now, after almost 4 years of marriage, Rhonda was finally starting to see Dave not as carefree, but as just plain reckless. The phone on the end table finally rang, jolting her from her thoughts. Rhonda picked it up. As she expected, it was Dave on the other end. What she really wanted to say, what was bubbling up inside her, was that she was angry, that she was tired, and that she was seriously considering filing for divorce. In fact, she had already taken a major step. She'd gone through her paperwork and quietly taken his name off of her retirement plan. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt significant. It was her preparing for a future without him. But she couldn't say any of that right now. She could see her mother-in-law standing in the doorway, pretending to be busy, but clearly listening in on the conversation. And so, instead of saying what she really felt, Rhonda just put on a brave face and said, "Hey Dave, how are you doing?" An hour later, Rhonda was back at her own home. She placed a casserole into the oven to heat up for dinner. Then, she turned on the cartoons for Amanda to keep her occupied and went outside. It was getting dark, but she was determined to mow the lawn. Rhonda was used to doing almost everything around the house by herself. Dave was practically never home anyway, between his band practice and his nights out with friends. But now that he was actually in jail, she had to do literally everything. That included wrestling with their old, unreliable lawnmower on a Sunday night. She wheeled the machine out of the garage and into the yard and gave the cord a hard pull to start the engine. The mower sputtered to life for a moment, then died. She tried again. It roared for a few seconds, then cut out again. As she was struggling with it, she noticed her neighbor coming out of his house across the street. He gave her a friendly wave as he walked down his driveway. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted for her to turn off the mower. Once she did, and the yard was quiet again, he called out, asking if she wanted to borrow his lawnmower, which he assured her actually worked. Rhonda looked around at the tall grass, then at the sky, which was getting darker by the minute. She glanced at her watch and realized her casserole would be done any second. She really appreciated the offer, but she just didn't have the time or the energy for it anymore. She shouted back that it was okay, she had to go back inside anyway. She said goodbye to her neighbor, pushed the defective lawnmower back into the garage, and made a mental note to call Dave's cousin, Nick, the next day. She figured maybe he could come by and fix it for her. Nick worked as a maintenance man at a big apartment complex and lived about 45 minutes away, but he'd been a huge help to Rhonda while Dave was in jail. Just last week, he had come over and fixed her washing machine. He was always calling to check in on her and Amanda, and she was grateful for his help. Back inside, Rhonda went straight to the kitchen and took the casserole out of the oven just as the timer was about to go off. She cut it into 2 pieces, one for her and a smaller one for Amanda, and brought the plates into the dining room. After setting them on the table, she walked over, turned off the television, scooped up her daughter from the living room floor, and carried her over to her high chair. It was getting late, and all Rhonda really wanted to do was eat quickly, clean up, and go to bed. But dinner with a toddler was never that simple. For every spoonful of food that made it into Amanda's mouth, it seemed another one wound up on the floor. Rhonda knew she was facing another round of cleanup before she could finally get some rest. But she also knew Amanda couldn't help it. She was just a little kid. So Rhonda reached over, took her daughter's fork, and started helping her eat, trying to minimize the mess and speed things up. In moments like these, Rhonda knew that Amanda was the one thing, the only thing, preventing her from just pulling the trigger on a divorce. She didn't know if she could handle being a single mother. It was hard enough having Dave gone for just a few weeks. She couldn't imagine doing this all by herself forever. And since she already had proof that Dave was bad at paying child support, the very reason he was in jail right now, she figured that even if a judge ordered him to pay her, she'd likely end up having to pay all the bills herself anyway. She would need to work full-time. Rhonda did have a job as an office assistant, but she wasn't sure if that salary would be enough to fully support herself and her daughter without any help. But just as she was scooping up another bite of casserole for Amanda, she heard a noise from outside. It sounded like heavy, hurried footsteps. She turned and looked towards the front window. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the dark silhouette of a person coming quickly up her driveway. The next morning, Monday, April 29th, a man named Gary Pulowski was at his desk at Hamilton Home Products, a heating equipment company just outside of Columbus. He noticed that his coworker, Rhonda Boggs, was running late for her shift. This was more than just unusual. It was unheard of. In all the time Rhonda had worked there, she had never once been late. Gary started asking around the office to see if anyone had heard from her, if maybe she had called in sick. But his coworkers all shook their heads. No one had heard from her since she left the office on Friday evening. Gary went back to his desk and tried calling Rhonda's landline at her house. It rang and rang, but no one picked up. He tried a few more times over the next hour, but still got no answer. He waited, hoping she might call back, but the phone on his desk remained silent. A knot of worry began to form in his stomach. He started to think that maybe she'd had car trouble. He knew it was about a 15-mile drive from her house in Pascala to the office, and back in 2002, not everyone had a cell phone. He didn't know if Rhonda did. If her car had broken down, she could be stranded on the side of the road with no way to call for help. And so, Gary made a decision. He told his boss he was going to check on her, got in his own car, and started driving the route from the office back towards Rhonda's house, hoping to spot her car on the shoulder. Gary drove the entire way to Pascala, his eyes peeled, scanning both sides of the road for any sign of Rhonda or her car, but he saw nothing. It wasn't until he finally turned the corner onto Rhonda's street that he saw her car. It was parked right in her driveway next to her small, white-paneled one-story house. At that moment, Gary's worry turned into a deep sense of dread. If her car was here, it meant Rhonda had never even left for work. And he knew with a chilling certainty that if she had stayed home this whole time without calling him or anyone else, something had to be very wrong. He pulled his car up to the curb, got out, and walked up the concrete path to the front door. He knocked, waited, then knocked again, louder this time. There was no answer. He walked around the side of the house to the back door and knocked there too. Still nothing but silence. He walked back around to the front of the house, feeling defeated, unsure of what to do next. He was about to leave and maybe call the police when he saw a flicker of movement in one of the front windows. The drapes were rustling. He squinted, trying to see what was causing it, and then his heart sank. He saw the small face of Rhonda's toddler daughter, Amanda, peering out at him. Her little face was red and splotchy, as if she had been crying for a very long time. Now, Gary started to panic, but he fought to keep his voice calm. He ran over to the window and shouted through the glass, telling Amanda that he was a friend of her mommy's. He tried to convince her to go to the front door and open it so he could come in and help her. It took a minute for the little girl to understand what he was asking, but eventually she seemed to get it. She disappeared from the window. A moment later, Gary heard the faint click of the lock on the front door, and it slowly creaked open. He rushed over and stepped inside. The first thing he saw stopped him cold. There were bloody footprints tracked across the living room carpet. Without a second thought, Gary instinctively scooped Amanda up into his arms, turned around, and ran out of the house. He sprinted across the street, pounded on the neighbor's door, and when they opened it, he yelled at them to call the police immediately. Not long after, officers from the Pascala Police Department arrived. This was the first homicide in their small town in 6 years. The entire police department only had 17 officers, and their crime scene unit was run out of a refurbished ambulance. Police Chief Chris Forchi knew he didn't have a ton of resources to throw at this case, but he called in every available officer and sent them to the crime scene. Then he headed out there himself to make sure everything was done by the book. By the time Forchi arrived at the house, his officers had already secured the perimeter with yellow tape. He ducked under the tape, walked inside, and followed the sounds of footsteps and the clicking of cameras into the kitchen. There, on the tile floor, a woman was lying in a large pool of blood. An officer informed Forchi that the victim had been identified as Rhonda Boggs. He explained that it was her coworker who had come to check on her that morning and had found her daughter alone in the house, which led to the 911 call. The officer also told him that Rhonda's toddler had been found physically uninjured. Forchi knelt down to examine the body. Right away, he could see more than a dozen stab wounds on her head, her neck, her chest, and her shoulders. The sheer number of wounds and the amount of blood spatter all over the kitchen told him there had been a violent struggle. It looked like Rhonda had fought back against her attacker, and fought hard. The remnants of a casserole were sitting on the stove, and Rhonda was still fully dressed. Forchi figured the attack must have happened sometime after dinner, but before she had gone to bed. He couldn't help but wonder if her poor little girl had been awake, or maybe even in the room when it happened. After the crime scene photographers had documented everything, Forchi gave the coroner's staff the go-ahead to move the body. As they carefully lifted Rhonda's body from the floor and placed it onto a stretcher, Forchi noticed something lying on the tile beneath where she had been. It was a steak knife, its blade covered in dried blood. He looked over at the kitchen counter and saw a knife block. The black handle on the murder weapon was a perfect match to the set of knives on the counter. It appeared Rhonda had been killed with a knife from her own kitchen. This was a significant detail. It meant her killer probably hadn't brought a weapon with them, which suggested this was a spontaneous, heat-of-the-moment crime rather than something that had been meticulously planned out. While his officers finished collecting forensic evidence in the kitchen, Forchi walked through the rest of the small house. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. In the bedroom, a jewelry box on the dresser was open and empty. The dresser drawers were pulled out, with piles of Rhonda's clothes thrown all over the floor. In the dining room, he found a purse that had been turned upside down, its contents spilled out across the table. It was clear that someone had been frantically searching through it. With the ransacked appearance of the house and the weapon of opportunity, Forchi's initial theory was that this was a robbery that had gone horribly wrong. But there was one detail that didn't quite fit. There was no sign of a forced entry anywhere. No broken windows, no pried open doors. Just then, Forchi heard a commotion near the front of the house. He walked over and saw a woman trying to push her way past his officers and into the home. Her face was red, she was sobbing uncontrollably, and she was shouting, demanding to know what had happened. Forchi gently took the woman outside and tried to calm her down. She eventually told him that her name was Kim Davis, and she was Rhonda's sister. Once Kim had caught her breath, Forchi had the difficult task of explaining what he knew so far. He told her that her sister had been found stabbed to death inside the house. He mentioned his running theory that it might have been a robbery, but he also pointed out that the lack of forced entry could mean that Rhonda knew her attacker, that she might have willingly let them into the house. Kim was obviously devastated by this news, and for a minute, Forchi just tried to console her. But he knew he had to press on with the investigation. Once she had calmed down a little, he asked her if she could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Rhonda. Kim immediately shook her head. She couldn't imagine her sister having any enemies at all. But after thinking about it for a moment, she said that actually there was one person who had a problem with Rhonda, and that was her own husband, Dave. Kim told the chief that Rhonda and Dave's marriage had been falling apart for a while. In fact, Rhonda had recently confided in her that she was thinking about getting a divorce. But then Kim added that Dave was currently in jail, so she didn't see how he could have possibly done this himself. Still, she thought it was possible that he could have been involved somehow. Maybe he had paid someone to do it, or convinced one of his shady friends to do it for him. Forchi promised Kim he would look into it, but he was already feeling skeptical. If Dave couldn't even afford to pay his child support, what were the chances he could afford to hire a hitman? And the murder weapon, coming from Rhonda's own kitchen, didn't fit with the idea of a planned assassination. At this point, Forchi believed their best chance to figure out what really happened was to speak with the only other known person at the scene of the crime, Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, Amanda. Later that day, a social worker from Child Services arrived at the house. Forchi met her outside and explained that before she took custody of Amanda, he was hoping she could help him. He needed her to try to talk to the little girl and see if she could tell them anything about the murder. The social worker agreed. Forchi took her across the street to the neighbor's house where Amanda had been staying all morning. Forchi knew it was a long shot. The little girl could be in shock, and at 2 years old, her memory and ability to communicate would be limited. He also knew that anything she did say might not be reliable. But he had to try. He stood quietly in the corner of the living room while the social worker sat down on the floor with Amanda. She gently asked the little girl what she had seen the night before. To Forchi's astonishment, Amanda looked up at the social worker and jerked her small hand toward her own neck, in a gesture that looked chillingly like a stabbing motion. Then, in a tiny, quiet voice, she said her mother had fallen down and gone to sleep. The social worker then asked her if anyone else had been there. Forchi found himself holding his breath, waiting for her answer. After a moment of silence, Amanda spoke a single name. She said, "Uncle Nick." A few hours later, Chief Forchi was still at the crime scene when a cruiser pulled up. 2 of his officers got out, pulled a grungy-looking man out of the back seat, and escorted him into the house. But this was not the Uncle Nick that Amanda had named. It was her father, Dave Boggs, who had been in jail when his wife was murdered. Forchi was absolutely planning to find and speak with this Uncle Nick, but first he wanted to gather as much information about him as he could. Amanda had said repeatedly that Uncle Nick had hurt her mommy. But as definitive as a 2-year-old could sound, Forchi knew he needed an adult's perspective before he made any moves. A judge had granted Dave an early release from jail because of the tragedy. Forchi had made sure Dave was brought directly to the crime scene so he could question him before Dave had a chance to talk to anyone else and potentially contaminate his memory. Forchi met Dave and the officers at the door and led them into the living room, sitting Dave down on the couch. They briefly filled him in on what had happened to his wife. But before he could fully process the shock, they told him they needed him to do a walkthrough of the house to help them identify what might have been stolen. But first, Forchi said he had a very important question. He looked at Dave and asked, "Who is Uncle Nick?" At this, Dave, who until that point had just looked completely shell-shocked, now looked confused. He told Forchi that Uncle Nick was the name his daughter used for his second cousin. His real name was Richard Nicholas Robinson, but everyone just called him Nick. He explained that Nick had been helping Rhonda out with things around the house while he was in jail. He said Nick had probably been over at the house almost every day, fixing one thing or another. But Dave said he couldn't understand why Forchi was asking about him. He insisted there was no way Nick would ever hurt Rhonda. He said Nick really looked out for her and for Amanda. Forchi didn't explain why he was asking. The information was enough. He went outside, got on his police radio, and broadcast a bulletin to all police departments in the area to be on the lookout for a man named Nick Robinson. Less than an hour later, a patrol car spotted Nick Robinson's SUV on State Route 37 just outside of Pataskala. They pulled him over. The officers ordered him out of the vehicle at gunpoint. As soon as he was out, they vulnerable to the ground, put a gun to the back of his head, and cuffed him. While they were cuffing him, they noticed a dark spot on his baseball cap that looked suspiciously like a bloodstain. As they placed him in the back of the cruiser, he kept asking what was going on, but the officers didn't answer him. Instead, they began to search his SUV. In the back, they found pieces of cardboard laid out, and on the cardboard were reddish-brown smears that also appeared to be blood. When the officers got back into their cruiser, Nick looked at them and asked, "Is this about Rhonda?" By the time the arrest was made, Chief Forchi was at Nick Robinson's house, questioning his wife, Debbie. So, he dispatched one of his best and only detectives, a man named Bruce Brooks, to go down to the police headquarters and handle Nick's interrogation. When Detective Brooks walked into the small interview room, he immediately saw that Nick, who was sitting at the table with his head in his hands, looked pale and sick. Brooks asked him if he was okay. Nick said he was just hungover from a long night of drinking. He laid out his alibi. He said he had been at a bar called Merry Melody in Columbus until around 10:30 the previous night. Then he had driven to another bar in Lancaster, a town near where he lived, called the Fairview Inn. He said he finally got home around 1:30 in the morning and passed out on his couch. Nick swore up and down that he didn't know anything about what had happened to Rhonda and that he only found out she was dead when he saw it on the news that day. As for the blood police found in his SUV and on his hat, he claimed it was just animal blood from a recent hunting trip. But Detective Brooks was not buying any of it. He had heard the 2-year-old girl, Amanda, say, "Uncle Nick hurts Mom." And while he knew a toddler's testimony was not something you could build an entire case on, the way she had said it and the stabbing gesture she had made at her own neck was incredibly compelling, especially since Rhonda had been found stabbed to death. So Brooks pushed back at Nick. He said if Nick's alibi was that he was too drunk to have committed the murder, then how could he be so sure he hadn't done it? If he was drunk enough to have gaps in his memory, then it was just as likely that he could have killed Rhonda in an alcohol-fueled blackout. But Nick just shook his head and kept saying, no. No seemed to be his answer for every question Brooks asked him. As the hours ticked by, the detective grew more and more frustrated with the constant denials. Finally, he decided to play his trump card. He told Nick that Rhonda's daughter had seen the whole thing. He painted a vivid picture for him, telling him to imagine that little girl on a witness stand in a courtroom with some defense lawyer poking and prodding her, forcing her to relive the most traumatic event of her entire life, the murder of her own mother. When he said that, a visible crack appeared in Nick's wall of denial. It was clear the image deeply disturbed him. Finally, a little after midnight, after 6 straight hours of interrogation, Nick agreed to take a lie detector test. When the results came back, the machine indicated that Nick was being deceptive. He had failed. But even then, instead of confessing, Nick dug in his heels and swore that he was innocent. So Brooks pulled out the last and most serious threat he could think of. He told Nick that if he didn't confess right then and there, he could be facing the death penalty. At that, Nick visibly cracked. The threat of execution seemed to shatter his resolve. After a long, heavy silence, Nick finally said that maybe, just maybe, he did have something to do with what happened, but he just couldn't remember it. From that point on, Brooks kept pushing and pushing relentlessly. Around 5 in the morning, Nick finally broke down completely and confessed to the murder. He said he had gone to Rhonda's house in between his visits to the 2 bars. He claimed he had tried to kiss her, but she had pulled away and grabbed a knife. He said that when he tried to take the knife away from her, he accidentally stabbed her. As the sun came up, officers drove Nick to the Licking County Jail and officially booked him for the murder of Rhonda Boggs. Later that morning, Chief Forchie stood in front of a group of reporters outside the police station and proudly announced that his officers had caught Rhonda's killer and secured a full confession in less than 24 hours. But later that week, Detective Brooks was in his office, finishing up paperwork on the case, when a secretary stuck her head in the door and told him there was a phone call for him. Brooks picked it up. The man on the other end of the line introduced himself as Bob Sisko. He said he was a bandmate of Rhonda's husband, Dave Boggs, and he was calling because he did not believe for a second that Nick was guilty. Bob told a strange story. He said that on the evening Rhonda was killed, another one of their former bandmates, a guy named Chris Williams, had stopped by his house. Bob said Chris had been acting very nervous and agitated. He was pacing around Bob's living room, chain-smoking cigarettes, and just seemed like his mind was a million miles away. Bob then revealed that Chris Williams had a history with Rhonda and Dave. In the past, he had actually robbed their house, stealing a bunch of band equipment and selling it for drug money. So, when Bob saw on the news that Rhonda was dead and her house had been robbed, he couldn't shake the feeling that Chris must have been involved. It just seemed like too much of a coincidence. Brooks wrote down all the information and thanked Bob for the tip, but he wasn't sure how seriously to take it. After all, they already had a signed confession from their primary suspect. Still, he discussed it with Chief Forchie, and the chief decided they should re-interview Rhonda's daughter just to cover all their bases. A few days later, about 2 weeks after the murder, Chief Forchie was waiting by the phone in his office, anxiously watching the clock. The same social worker who had spoken to Amanda the first time was interviewing her again, and she was supposed to call him with an update at any minute. Forchie was hoping, praying, that the little girl would just repeat the same story she had told on the day of her mother's murder. But when his phone finally rang and he picked it up, he learned that was not what happened. The social worker told him that this time, when she asked Amanda who she saw on the night of the murder, the little girl did not say anything about Uncle Nick. Instead, she said, Bob did it. When Forchie heard this, a wave of anxiety washed over him. He had been afraid from the beginning that a toddler was not a reliable eyewitness. She could just be throwing out any name that popped into her head. But he also thought it was a bizarre coincidence. Of all the people she could have named, she said Bob, the same name as the man who had just called the station trying to point the finger at someone else. Something just felt off. But as Forchie thought about it, he decided it didn't really change the fundamentals of their case. Nick had confessed. He had admitted to doing it. They didn't really need Amanda as a witness to make the charges stick. So, 5 days later, a grand jury officially indicted Nick Robinson on murder charges, and then, to the complete and utter surprise of the investigators, Nick pled not guilty. He was now officially claiming that police had coerced him into a false confession and that he was not Rhonda Boggs' killer. About 7 months later, in December of 2002, a man named Matt Sauer stepped into a bar called the Merry Melody in Columbus, Ohio. He walked up to the counter, pulled a manila folder out of his messenger bag, and showed the bartender a photograph inside. He asked the bartender if he recognized the man in the picture. The bartender glanced down at the photo for a second, then looked back up at Sauer and nodded. He said yes, that was Nick Robinson. He said Nick had been in the bar 8 months ago, on the night of the murder. The bartender then said he had been waiting for the police to come and talk to him because he knew for a fact that Nick was there that night. Sauer was a little taken aback by how certain the bartender was. He asked him how could he be so sure it was him, and how could he possibly remember that specific night so clearly after all this time. But the bartender had a quick and convincing answer. He said the reason he remembered Nick so vividly was because Nick had been wearing a very unique, unforgettable t-shirt that night. It had an obscene joke printed on it about women's bodies. It was the kind of shirt you just don't forget. The bartender said Nick had stayed at the bar on the night of the murder until at least 10:15, maybe even 10:30. He was absolutely certain of the time. And so, the bartender said again that he was just surprised it had taken this long for law enforcement to come and confirm Nick's whereabouts. Sauer closed his folder, thanked the bartender, and set his business card down on the counter. When the bartender picked it up, he looked surprised. Matt Sauer was not a police officer. He was a private investigator, and he had been hired by Nick Robinson's family to clear his name. Sauer knew this was going to be an uphill battle. Nick had already confessed to the murder. But he was hoping this interview with the bartender would be the first step in poking a massive hole in the prosecution's case against him. Now that he had this solid testimony, Sauer left the bar, got in his car, and drove to the second bar Nick had claimed to be at on the night of the murder, the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. When he got there, he showed the staff the same photograph. And just like the bartender at the Merry Melody, they all remembered Nick as well. They confirmed he was there on the night of April 28th, the night of the murder. And they remembered him for the exact same reason, his distinctive t-shirt. At that moment, Sauer knew he was onto something big. The prosecution's entire case was built on a timeline where Nick left the Merry Melody bar, drove to Rhonda's house and killed her, and then went to the Fairview Inn. But the staff at both bars said Nick was wearing the shirt. Sauer thought, if Nick had violently stabbed Rhonda to death in between his visits to these two bars, wouldn't that shirt have been covered in blood? And wouldn't the staff at the second bar have remembered not just the distinctive shirt, but the distinctive shirt that was soaked in blood? That's a detail no one would forget. But they didn't mention it. They just said he was wearing that shirt. A few days later, Sauer drove back to the Merry Melody bar. But this time, he didn't go inside. He pulled his car into their parking lot, took out a stopwatch, and started it. Then he pulled out of the parking lot and drove the exact route to the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. When he pulled into their parking lot, he stopped the watch. The drive had taken him just about 45 minutes. According to the prosecution's timeline, Nick had left the Merry Melody, murdered Rhonda, and then driven to the Fairview, all within a window of 30 to 45 minutes. But Sauer's simple experiment with his stopwatch proved that was physically impossible. There was simply no way for Nick to have driven all the way to Rhonda's house, committed a violent murder, and then made it to the second bar in that amount of time. It just couldn't be done. Which meant Nick's alibi was airtight. He could not have been the killer. Now, Sauer just had to figure out who was. Matt Sauer took the evidence he had gathered to Nick's defense attorney. The attorney then presented it to the judge and made a crucial request. They asked for a court order to test a key piece of evidence that, for some reason, the Pascala police had never bothered to send to the crime lab, the murder weapon itself. The judge agreed, and the knife was sent for testing. A month later, in January of 2003, the results came back from the lab. They discovered there was DNA on the knife from an unknown individual, someone other than Rhonda. Back in 2003, DNA databases were not what they are today. You couldn't just run an unknown profile against a massive database. You had to have a suspect to compare it to. But they were able to test the DNA against a sample from Nick, and the results were definitive. The DNA on the murder weapon was not his. This cast serious doubt on Nick as the killer, but it still wasn't enough to get the charges dropped. Not until Sauer could figure out who that DNA belonged to. So Sauer went back to digging through the police files. He quickly realized there were a lot of potential suspects the police had never even bothered to look at. There was Rhonda's husband, Dave, who had been flagged by Rhonda's own sister on day one. He couldn't have done it himself, but he could have asked someone to do it for him. That meant all of Dave's friends, acquaintances, and even people he met in jail were potential suspects. There was also Chris Williams, the former bandmate who had robbed their house before to get drug money. And of course, there was Bob Sisko, the man who had called in the tip about Chris. At one point, Rhonda's daughter had even said the name Bob. Any one of them could have been the killer. But because the police had focused so narrowly on Nick, the investigation was essentially starting over from square one almost 9 months after the crime. The real killer could be someone the police had never even heard of. With so little to go on, Sauer decided to focus on the one concrete thing he had, a list of the items that had been stolen from Rhonda's house. He decided he would try to track down those items, hoping they would lead him to the person who actually committed the murder. A few days later, Sauer found himself walking slowly down the aisle of a pawn shop in Columbus, scanning the shelves for any of the items from his list. But just like all the other pawn shops he had visited that day, he came up empty. He was beginning to think it was a dead end. It was possible these stolen items were never pawned, or maybe they were pawned in another state. But it seemed most likely they would be somewhere in the general area. After visiting several more pawn shops and finding nothing, Sauer finally decided to call it a day and head home, feeling frustrated. On his drive back, he was stopped at a red light. As he sat there idling, he happened to look out his window and saw a Bureau of Motor Vehicles office, a DMV. The sight of it triggered something in his mind. He remembered reading in the case file that one of the persons of interest on his list had been arrested for car theft about a week after Rhonda's murder. But according to the same file, that suspect already owned a car of their own, a blue Cadillac. So why would they need to steal another car? On a whim, Sauer pulled into the DMV parking lot. He went inside, walked up to a clerk, and asked them to look up the records for that specific blue Cadillac. He gave the clerk the license plate number. The clerk typed it into the computer and quickly found that on the 30th of April, 2002, just one day after Rhonda's body had been found, that exact blue Cadillac had been sold to a woman in Columbus named Letitia Gordon. Sauer left the DMV and drove straight to Letitia's house. He knocked on the door. The woman who opened it looked a bit scared when he introduced himself as a private investigator, but she also didn't seem surprised to see him. Letitia told Sauer that she knew why he was there. It was about the blue Cadillac she had bought. She explained that she had purchased the car from a stranger right off the street. He had offered to sell it to her for just $300, an offer that was too good to pass up. However, when she got home with her new car, she started cleaning it out and found a pile of stuff in the back seat that the seller had left behind. It included clothes, jewelry, and a purse. Inside that purse, she found a photo ID. The name on that ID was Rhonda Boggs. And with that, Sauer was finally able to piece together what really happened on the night of the 28th of April, 2002. On that night, while Rhonda Boggs was finishing up dinner with her daughter, her killer parked their blue Cadillac just down the street. That killer, desperate and in a rage, stormed over to Rhonda's house, stomped up her driveway, and rang the doorbell. When Rhonda opened the door, she looked confused and frightened to see this person on her doorstep. She asked them what they were doing there, but the killer just brushed past her, walked into her kitchen, and immediately started digging through her purse, which was sitting on the counter. Rhonda tried to stop them, but when she put her hands on them, the killer, without any hesitation, grabbed a steak knife from the knife block and stabbed her in the chest. Rhonda fell to the ground. She tried to fight back, to stand up, but the killer was on top of her, stabbing her again and again until she stopped moving. The killer stood up, backing away from Rhonda's body, which now lay in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. Then, they simply continued to ransack the house, stealing whatever money and valuables they could find. As they were about to leave, they saw Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, Amanda, standing silently in the hallway, watching them. The killer paid the child no mind, hurried right past her and out the door, got back into their blue Cadillac, and spent the rest of the night on a massive drug binge. The next morning, they sold that car to a woman on the street for quick cash, accidentally leaving Rhonda's stolen purse, her ID, and her jewelry in the back. The killer was Chris Williams, Dave Boggs' former bandmate, the same man who had robbed them once before. On the night of the murder, he was high on crack cocaine and desperately needed money for his next fix. Rhonda had simply gotten in his way. Chris was arrested and charged with Rhonda's murder. On the 28th of March 2005, a jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 years to life for the murder, with a total of 28 years for aggravated robbery, burglary, and for escaping from a halfway house. After Chris Williams was charged, all the charges against Nick Robinson were finally dropped. For Nick, the entire ordeal was life-changing. Once he was free and back home, he stopped drinking completely. He returned to his job, and he filed a lawsuit against the city of Pascala for $3 million in damages for the wrongful arrest and the coerced confession that nearly cost him his life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the afternoon of Saturday, the 6th of February, 2010, 61-year-old Alan Lilu set up an ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a small house just outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could just make out the rich smell of beef bourguignon simmering on the stove. But Alan and the 37-year-old woman cooking the meal were not speaking to each other. The silence in the house was heavy and uncomfortable. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and this house, the one they were currently in, was a house Alan had bought for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra had started out as Alan's assistant many years ago, but over time, their relationship had evolved into something much deeper, something more like a father and a daughter. Even now, years after Alexandra had stopped working for him, they remained incredibly close. And of course, Alan had literally bought her this home to ensure she and her daughter had a stable life. As a result of this close bond, Alan found himself visiting her often, helping out around the house, doing small chores, and just being a presence in her life. He also paid for her car and for their vacations. Alan could certainly afford to be this generous. He was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a surprisingly huge business in France. Many large companies would book entire circus shows for their end-of-the-year parties for employees, and Alan had managed to secure many major lucrative contracts. His business was so successful that his main office was located in a fancy chateau in the countryside. His wife, Elizabeth, lived in a separate home, a luxury ski town near the Swiss border. Alan himself was constantly on the move, traveling all over Europe for his work. But this fast-paced life could also be a real grind. In just the past 24 hours, Alan had driven more than 1,200 miles, racing between meetings with potential clients and scouting for new circus performers. So he placed a lot of value on the quiet time he could spend at Alexandra's house. It was his escape, a place where he could recharge in the peaceful suburbs and, more importantly, spend time with someone he cared a great deal about. Now, Alan wasn't naive. He knew that his friends and his coworkers all assumed he and Alexandra were having an affair. He was almost certain that's what his own wife, Elizabeth, believed as well. And to be fair, their assumptions weren't entirely baseless. Alan was known to have plenty of extramarital relationships. He also frequently engaged with sex workers and made very little effort to hide any of it from anyone. He and his wife lived completely separate lives, and they seemed to have a silent understanding. She had her life of luxury in the mountains, and he had his freedom to do as he pleased. But Alan's relationship with Alexandra was genuinely different. It had always been platonic. They had never so much as kissed or even held hands. Alan had no children of his own, and he truly enjoyed playing the role of a father figure to Alexandra and a grandfather figure to her young daughter. But right now, they were in the middle of a big fight, and Alan was anxious to fix it. Alexandra's daughter was away for the weekend, staying with friends. So he and Alexandra had planned to have a nice, quiet dinner together this evening before Alan had to get back on the road for another business trip on Sunday afternoon. But Alan, in a moment he now deeply regretted, had somewhat stupidly brought up Alexandra's past. And what started as a simple conversation had quickly escalated into a horrible fight. They had been yelling at each other on and off ever since. Alexandra was intensely defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris full of dreams. She had fallen in love and had a baby, but the baby had tragically died. Her relationship fell apart soon after, and she had spiraled into a period of very self-destructive behavior. By the time Alan first met her back in 2002, which was 8 years before this argument in the little house, Alexandra was at a very low point. She had a 2-year-old daughter by then and was struggling immensely to provide for her. She was working a patchwork of minimum wage jobs and small side hustles, barely making ends meet. So when Alan had offered her a job as his full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. It gave her stability and a future. But deep down, there was a part of her that seemed to resent Alan's power over her more than she was grateful for his help. It was like he had total control over her well-being, her home, her car, her entire life. And she didn't always like that feeling of dependency. And so, with all that weighing on his mind, Alan left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen. He was hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could finally have a real, calm conversation. Once he was in the kitchen, he glanced over at Alexandra, who was stirring the pot on the stove, her back to him. He couldn't quite read her mood. He turned, opened the refrigerator door, and just stared inside, not really looking for anything to eat or drink. He was just biding his time, hoping she would be the first one to speak. To his immense relief, Alexandra did turn around. She playfully swung a dish towel at his arm, telling him he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad anymore. Alan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He smiled and closed the fridge door. He then suggested she come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the last load of laundry to dry so he could finish the ironing for her. A few minutes later, they were both sitting on the sofa, each with a glass of red wine. Alexandra asked Alan how his business was going. He told her it was good, which was technically true. His company was on track to bring in around $4 million that year, which is about $5 million today. But despite how things looked on paper, Alan was feeling a lot of stress. He made the vast majority of his money through those big corporate contracts. But he wasn't the only one in the game. His number one competitor was another circus owner named Michel de la Rue. And recently, Michel had been outbidding Alan on one contract after another. It was starting to feel personal, like Michel was specifically targeting Alan's existing clients, trying to steal them away from him, rather than trying to cultivate his own business. Alan explained to Alexandra that on Monday, he had a very important meeting in Vichy, a city in central France, which was about a 4-hour drive south of her house. At this meeting, Alan was hoping to land a huge contract, a real game changer for the year, as long as Michel didn't swoop in and steal it out from under him again. Alexandra gently put her hand on Alan's arm and told him not to worry. She said she was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success. She suggested they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip he had booked for the two of them and her daughter. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to take care of the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Alan sat by himself for a moment, just thinking. He was really looking forward to that vacation she had mentioned. In part, it was because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately. She had a new boyfriend, a 42-year-old IT engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Alan and Yves got along just fine, but he could tell that things were getting pretty serious between Alexandra and Yves. They might even get married. And Alan couldn't help but worry that if that happened, Yves might eventually start to resent him for his role in Alexandra's life. He worried that Yves might see him as an overbearing figure who was a little too involved. But he decided he wasn't going to let that fear ruin the evening. As Alexandra came back into the living room with a basket of laundry, Alan picked up a book from the coffee table and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Alan was back in his car, packed and ready, heading out of town for his big meeting. But what no one would realize until much, much later was that there was a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alan Lilu's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a cup of coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up and heard the voice of Alan's longtime assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried. She was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. This was a strange call to receive. Alan was a creature of habit when it came to his work. He was not the type of person to just disappear and not tell his secretary where he was going. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that no, she hadn't heard from Alan in a few days. Then she asked Sylvie what was going on. And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's explanation, she felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Apparently, Alan had that very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had never shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he had a reservation for the night before. Sylvie said she had already tried reaching out to several of Alan's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him. And he wasn't answering the repeated calls she was making to both of his cell phones, which both appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alan was famous for spending entire days glued to his phones. He was always in communication with someone. She couldn't even recall a single time when he'd been unreachable, even for a few minutes. So Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she had called, but that she would take over from here. Then Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and immediately called the police to report her husband missing. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres. Up until this point, Alan's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case. The local police in Alan's wife's hometown were handling the initial inquiry, which was pretty basic. They had made a few phone calls and filed the standard reports. But now, enough time had passed without any sign of Alan and with no new evidence coming in. The original report had been escalated to the Criminal Investigation Division. They were now considering the possibility that this could be a kidnapping or something even worse. This young officer was now standing at this particular house because it was the last place Alan was known to have been before he vanished. The door of the home opened, and a thin, blonde woman looked out at him. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she confirmed that it was. When he explained to her that he was there as part of the investigation into Alan Lilu's disappearance, Alexandra's face immediately clouded with concern, and she invited him inside. As she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, the officer looked around, taking a mental inventory of the space. The house was clean, but a bit cluttered with toys that obviously belonged to a young girl, scattered here and there. The officer scanned the room for any signs of a physical struggle or any kind of violence, things like damage to the walls or overturned furniture, but there was nothing that stood out. Nothing seemed out of place or concerning. Alexandra started asking the officer a series of anxious questions about what was going on with Alan. Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? What did the police know? But the young officer just shook his head and explained that for now, they really didn't know much at all. He was just there to try to build a clear timeline of Alan's last known movements. And so, speaking of that, he asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Alan. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to recount all the details she could recall. She explained that Alan was like a surrogate father to her and that he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had stayed with her on Friday, all day Saturday, and then had left on Sunday afternoon. He had to get on the road to drive to Vichy for his big meeting on Monday morning. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him, but she said that was pretty typical for them. She stressed that their relationship was not romantic in any way. It was truly platonic, and he didn't always check in with her the way a spouse or a romantic partner would. It was more like they were just really close friends. The officer nodded as he wrote down everything she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and genuinely worried, but he was still suspicious of the idea that she and Alan were not romantically involved. It just seemed unlikely given the circumstances. So, before he left, he asked if he could see the rest of her house. He was doing this in part just to gauge her reaction. If she said no or got defensive, he would know to probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed without any hesitation. and she gave him a full tour, taking him all around the house and showing him any room he wanted to see. What he found was that the rest of the house seemed just as normal and unremarkable as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the front door and promised him that she would call immediately if Alan reached out to her. And so, after leaving Alexandra's house, the officer, wanting to be thorough, went door to door up and down Alexandra's street. He asked her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend, trying to see if anything they said contradicted Alexandra's story. But everyone he spoke to more or less confirmed what she had told him. Alan was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question. They all said that nothing had seemed off or unusual at all. So, eventually, the officer left and went back to the station. When he got there, he wrote up his report highlighting Alan's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Alan's wife lived, continued to follow up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Alan's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions. Everything showed no activity at all after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and all of his friends, but no one had heard anything. They even put in an official request to the car company, Audi, for the GPS data that was stored in Alan's car, which was a large Audi Q7 SUV. The investigators knew it was entirely possible that Alan had chosen to disappear. He was very wealthy, he had lots of connections all over Europe. It was a possibility that he had simply decided to walk away from his life. And if that was the case, it would be incredibly difficult to find him. However, it was a lot harder to hide a car that logged all of its travel data. And so whether Alan's disappearance was voluntary, an accident, or the result of foul play, the police knew that finding his Audi was likely the best hope they had of knowing where to even begin looking for Alan. On the 26th of February 2010, 19 days since Alan had been reported missing, a detective named Pierre Martin stood in a secure impound lot in the city of Orléans, France, looking at Alan's gray Audi Q7. The GPS data that the police had requested from Audi had finally come back a few days earlier, and it had led detectives to a surprising location. Again, the last place where Alan was known to have been before he vanished was leaving the home of his surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicolas, near Chartres, and supposedly heading to Vichy for a business meeting. But his Audi had not been found in Chartres or in Vichy. Instead, it had been discovered abandoned in the parking lot of a train station in Orléans, which was a city roughly in between those two other cities. And so, to the police, it looked like he had gotten about halfway to his destination and then just stopped for some reason. When they had first located the car, the first thing they did was set up a surveillance team to watch it for 2 full days. They wanted to see if maybe Alan or somebody else would return to it. For context, the parking lot where the car was found was in a pretty rough part of town, an area where violent crime and sex work were common. So it was possible that any number of people could potentially approach the car or try to break into it. It just seemed like a seedy enough area where if they watched it long enough, something might happen. But after 2 days, nobody had shown up. So, finally, they just had the car towed to the impound lot so that forensic technicians could process it and look for any evidence. And Detective Martin was here to personally oversee that process. The forensic techs began to circle the vehicle, taking photos of the outside from every angle and carefully dusting for fingerprints. There was no visible damage anywhere on the exterior of the car, and there were no signs of any attempt to break into it. Plus, when they looked through the windows, they could see Alan's briefcase and his luggage were still sitting inside the car. This meant that the car being found where it was likely not the result of a simple car theft. This didn't seem like somebody just stole his car for a joyride and then dumped it. It seemed like how this car got here was directly connected to what had happened to Alan. And as he followed that line of thinking, it seemed more and more likely that what happened to Alan probably fell into the category of foul play. However, when the technicians finally opened up the car doors and began dusting for prints inside, the upholstery and the dashboard were disappointingly clean. There was nothing there. This didn't exactly support the idea that foul play had occurred inside the car. It just deepened the mystery. But after a few more minutes of thoroughly scanning the interior of the car, one of the technicians pushed a button near the driver's side door that electronically opened the trunk. After the trunk lid lifted open, Detective Martin walked around to the back of the SUV to look inside. And what he saw was a bulky object wrapped completely in a pink bedsheet. And right away, Martin had a sinking feeling in his chest as one of the techs reached forward with a gloved hand and carefully pulled the sheet back. And almost immediately, Martin's worst suspicions were confirmed. Underneath that pink sheet was a body. It was a man's body, fully clothed and curled up in the fetal position. There was no doubt in his mind that this was Alan Lilu. But there was no visible blood, no wounds, and no bruises anywhere on his body. And there was no blood in the trunk itself. When Detective Martin reached in to try to move Alan's body to examine him further, he found that his body was already incredibly rigid with rigor mortis. The coroner on the scene told Martin that she would hopefully have some answers for him after she conducted the autopsy. The weather over the past few weeks had been very cold, which was actually good for evidence collection because it basically meant the trunk had acted like a refrigerator, preserving Alan's soft tissues. As the coroner wheeled the body away on a gurney, Martin just stood there, staring at the now empty trunk. He had no theories about when or why or even how Alan had died. All he knew for certain was that this was now officially a murder investigation. Detective Martin returned to his office at the police station and got straight to work. Since Alan's body was found in Orleans, the jurisdiction for the case fell to him, and he was now in charge of the murder investigation. His first step was to review all the witness statements and all the other evidence that had already been gathered by the other police departments. And right away, the picture these files painted told Martin that this was going to be a very complex investigation with a lot of potential suspects and multiple locations to consider. Alan was a workaholic who was always on the move, and he had no apparent connection to the city of Orleans where his body had ended up. In fact, it seemed he rarely spent more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, his life seemed to be a constant balancing act between his office, a series of hotels, with frequent stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to the reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she had confirmed that Alan was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so, this made her the last known person to see Alan alive, which, in Martin's mind, automatically made her a person of interest. However, Alexandra's story about Alan leaving her house on Sunday, February 7th, seemed to match up perfectly with the data Martin had from Alan's car, his cell phone, and his credit card records. All of those records showed that Alan really did leave her house and travel to Orleans on that day, and then, for reasons that were still unknown, all communication and all financial activity just stopped. It seemed very likely that was the day he was killed. Right from the beginning, just like the young police officer who had originally visited Alexandra and taken her statement, Detective Martin found it very hard to believe that her relationship with Alan was not romantic. It just seemed, based on how frequently they saw each other and the fact that Alan was buying her major things like a house and a car and paying for vacations, that there had to be more to the story than what they were being told. But even though that cast a certain level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just the logical side of the situation for Detective Martin. The size difference between Alan and Alexandra was significant. Alan was a big guy. He weighed about 240 pounds. And Alexandra was very small and petite. Now, was it impossible for her to kill him, lift his body into the trunk of his car, and dump it in Orleans? No, it wasn't impossible. But it just seemed very unlikely. And so that idea was just sort of floating in the back of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Alan's business associates and his wife had provided. First off, Alan apparently had a lot of affairs with a lot of different women. And so, that meant that every single one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners connected to them, were also potential suspects. It also meant that Allen's wife, Elizabeth, had a very clear motive to want her husband dead. Basically, he was openly cheating on her all the time. That had to be a powerful motivation for her to want him gone. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth would have literally done the killing herself, because her phone records and other evidence showed she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband was likely killed. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman to do it for her. And the second thing that Detective Martin learned from the business associates and from Allen's wife was that Allen's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Allen's employees and his colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless businessman. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was always flying around. And so, because Martin had been handed this murder investigation with an overwhelming number of potential suspects, instead of just being paralyzed by where to even start, Martin assembled a team of his very best deputies. And they set to work, meticulously re-interviewing every single person connected to Allen, and, from those interviews, making a new, prioritized list of suspects. 3 weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orleans police station. He sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly and seemed very calm. The man's name was Michel de la Rue, and he was Allen's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's #1 suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anyone else's. And this was because immediately after Allen had disappeared, Michel had started aggressively contacting all of Allen's clients, trying to get them to sign new contracts with his company instead. It was a pretty cutthroat and cold-hearted thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on the value of these contracts Michel was going after. They added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which, in the detective's mind, was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel had killed Allen specifically to absorb his business. And not only that, but the coroner had, by this point, come back with Allen's official cause of death. He had been strangled, likely using some kind of ligature like a rope or a belt. And the coroner estimated that it likely took between 5 to maybe even 10 minutes for Allen to actually die. That meant that someone had been actively strangling him for a very long time. That is a long, physically demanding time to be right on top of somebody, killing them. And there were also some scratches found on Allen's legs, which suggested that his body had been lifted and dragged into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, had clearly taken place somewhere else outside of the car, and all of that meant that whoever killed Allen had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michel now, Detective Martin thought that he certainly fit that description. He seemed like a fit, strong man. However, as Martin began asking Michel questions and watching his face and his body language for any signs of anxiety or defensiveness that might suggest he was hiding something, what he found was that Michel seemed completely open and very straightforward. He acted like he had nothing to hide. Michel immediately acknowledged that he had been trying to poach Allen's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. He said that was just business. He said he was sure that if their positions had been reversed, Allen would have done the exact same thing to him. And besides, he said, he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend, when the coroner believed Allen had been killed, Michel had been hundreds of miles away on a ski trip. And then Michel produced a folder that was full of receipts and a list of phone numbers of people who could verify his story. He handed it over to Martin, who took it. He told Michel to sit tight. Then the detective got up and left the interrogation room. He handed the folder over to another detective and told him to start checking everything out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to go in and take a shot at questioning Michel. The idea was to create a sort of good cop, bad cop dynamic to see if maybe a new face and a new approach would rattle Michel. And so, Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and tried to break Michelle's story. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So, Martin signaled for yet another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a very run-of-the-mill conversation with Michelle and made no progress at all. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michelle in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around, and it was one of his deputies. The deputy told Martin that, unfortunately, he had called all the people on Michelle's list, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had even spoken to the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michelle's alibi was solid. It had checked out completely. He clearly could not have physically been able to kill Alan. He was verifiably at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he couldn't just keep Michelle there indefinitely, just hoping to catch him in a lie. Even if there was some remote possibility he was involved, there just wasn't enough evidence to hold him. And so, he had to let Michelle go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk, combing through the case files again, when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was someone at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. This was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local newspapers, basically saying, "Hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me." And he was hoping that whoever this person was potentially that witness. And so, Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby. And there, he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was a man who appeared to be in his early 50s, and he was dressed all in black, with shiny black shoes and dark glasses. Martin wondered if maybe this was another one of Alan's business contacts. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then, this man introduced himself. And when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. The man said his name was Remy Seren, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even wasting his time by bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy, "Thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this, you need to go." But then he thought better of it. The truth was, Martin was having absolutely no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alan's car. There were no usable fingerprints. And while the pink bedsheet that Alan's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, it didn't match anything in their criminal database. And then, the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either. And he'd found no evidence at all that anyone in either Alan's personal or business circles had taken out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alan's surrogate daughter, Alexandra, and all the women he was having affairs with, and even all the sex workers they could find who he had engaged with. And none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made any sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little bit of curiosity and a whole lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy, the psychic, back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought he knew. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alan while he was driving in his car. And when he heard the story, he had a vision that was so vivid and so powerful that he actually had to pull over to the side of the road. He said he saw Alan Lilu as clear as day, locked in a physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name, and he couldn't describe her face, but he was certain that a woman was somehow directly involved in Alan's murder. At first, Martin was disappointed. Unsurprisingly, this just felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody pretending to be a psychic, someone who claimed they could see things that nobody else could. It just seemed like he threw out this random generic idea as if it was some big revelation, and it just didn't feel like it was. But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say that he was sure that Alan was not killed in Orléans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alan's body had been taken away from the murder scene and placed in the trunk of the car after he was already dead. And this immediately caught Martin's attention. Because the coroner had been certain that Alan was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transport, But critically, the police had not released that specific piece of information to the press. They had held it back specifically so they could weed out fake tips and false confessions. And so, for Remy to say that, how would he have known that detail? Now, Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy. But it just seemed so specific, so on the nose, that he began to reconsider what else Remy had said. This idea that Alan was struggling with a woman, that was something that Martin had not really considered seriously. He had sort of ruled most women out as the primary suspect because of how big Alan had been and how physical and brutal this murder had to have been. It just seemed much more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now, Martin wasn't so sure. And suddenly, it seemed entirely possible that maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk because he had an idea. Lots of people in Alan's life had told the police investigating his murder that Alan had had many extramarital affairs. Now, Detective Martin and his team had already spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Alan, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now, after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Alan's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orleans where Alan's car had been parked was pretty sketchy. It was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew that Alan engaged with sex workers. That was one of the things he did. And they had spoken to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as suspects. And so, for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar as a primary suspect pool. However, now, with fresh eyes, he was thinking, maybe the reason Alan was in Orleans in the first place was because he was there to meet a sex worker. And while he was there, something went terribly wrong, and it resulted in his death. So, Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Alan's laptop. Now, the forensic techs had already been through it once, looking at all of Alan's emails and his business records. But Martin was looking for something different. He was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Alan had found sex workers to visit. Basically, what he was doing was making a new, truly exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever engaged with online. This was a much bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through. And as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to track down and speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Alan was engaging with had any connection to the city of Orleans. And they also did not appear to have any real issues with Alan himself, at least not based on the messages that were on his laptop. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came across one new profile. This woman was named Marie Eve. And when he took in who this woman was, and saw her picture, and read her information, he knew right then and there that he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation, as well as a full confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Alan Lilu on the day he was murdered. The killer found themselves standing behind Alan, and inside they were burning with a white-hot rage. Alan seemed to think he was so much better than the killer just because he was this powerful businessman, and the killer was, in his eyes, just a sex worker. The killer had tolerated Alan's condescending behavior for a long time because Alan had money and power. But now, Alan had pushed it too far. The killer felt like they had to shut him up for good. Alan's own belt lay on a nearby chair. And impulsively, the killer grabbed it. They lunged forward and looped the leather belt around Alan's throat from behind. At first, Alan struggled. He reached up with his large hands, trying to pull the belt off. He had no idea what was happening. But the killer just held on tight, pulling with all their might. And for several agonizing minutes, there was this unbelievable death struggle going on in the quiet house. And Allen, he was fighting for his life. He was a big guy, and he was getting close to pulling the belt free. But then, something unbelievable happened. The killer had braced themselves against the ironing board that was set up behind them. And so, with their back pressed up against it, they were pulling as hard as they could with the belt against Allen's throat. And as they were leaning back with all their weight, the ironing board they were braced against suddenly broke. The legs buckled. And because the killer didn't let go of the belt and was applying maximum pressure, when they fell backwards, it created a violent whiplash effect. Their body tumbled to the floor, and all of that force was driven instantly into Allen's throat. That sudden, violent jerk crushed Allen's larynx, and he immediately went still. And so, just for good measure, the killer held on for a couple more minutes, pulling as tightly as they could across his throat, really ensuring that Allen was dead. And when Allen did not move at all, eventually the killer let go of the belt and stood up, their heart pounding, just taking in the scene. Then, as reality began to set in for the killer, they realized they needed help getting rid of the body. This was a huge man. How were they going to get rid of it on their own? So, the killer called their accomplice. The accomplice was hundreds of miles away at a ski resort, but they immediately told the killer to wait and they would drive to them. Sure enough, the next day, the accomplice arrived. And together, they helped the killer load Allen's body into the trunk of Allen's own car. Then, the killer climbed into the driver's seat of Allen's car and drove it to the train station in Orleans. And following behind them as they made this grim journey was a second car being driven by the killer's accomplice. The killer and the accomplice would abandon Allen's car and his body in that rough part of Orleans, and then together they would drive away in the second car. Shortly thereafter, they would actually get married. Because the killer was Allen's own surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola. And Alexandra's troubled past that she was so defensive about included the fact that she was a sex worker who used the online name Marie Eve. Her accomplice was her new boyfriend, Yves Bernard. So Alexandra and Allen had fought previously about her troubled history. She was especially mad that at one point, Allen had implied that Alexandra's daughter could end up just like her, as if that would be a horrible thing. So on that Saturday, February 6th, when Allen brought up Alexandra's daughter again, just in conversation, something inside of Alexandra snapped. It just felt so deeply disrespectful that he was once again talking about her daughter in that way, and out of pure impulse, she had grabbed his belt, wrapped it around his neck, strangled him, and then, in that freak accident, stumbled backwards, crushing his larynx and killing him. In a way, it was sort of true what Alexandra had told the police when they initially questioned her. Allen had left her house in his car on February 7th, and she had not seen him again. What she had conveniently left out was that Allen was already dead in the trunk of his car when he left. Alexandra Nicola confessed to the murder of Allen Lilu and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Yves Bernard, was sentenced to 2 years for the concealment of a dead body. The couple has since been released from prison, and together, they have a child who was born before Alexandra began her sentence. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.